The history of the three duchies explored here reveals several striking similarities, but one pattern stands out above all. Between the mid-9th and mid-11th centuries, each of them spent long stretches of time under the control of a single dominant family. In Amalfi and Naples, the origins of those ruling houses can be traced with at least some clarity. Gaeta is a different case. The family that rose there in the later 9th century appears almost without warning in the surviving records. Before their arrival, there is virtually no clear sign of them. That makes the rise of the first great Gaetan ruler especially intriguing. Who was he? Where did he come from? And how did he manage to take control so completely? The surviving material suggests that a man named Doibilis emerged as the leading figure in Gaeta around the year 867. From that point forward, his family would dominate the town and its surrounding territory for roughly a century and a half. Earlier documents point to another ruling circle before his arrival. In 839, a man named Constantine, son of Anatolius, received 2 landed estates from his sister Elizabeth and her husband Theodosius, who held the office of prefect in Naples. The terms of the arrangement required rent payments in kind to be sent back to Naples. The agreement was witnessed by Constantine's son, Marinus. Similar grants were made again in 866. These details strongly suggest that Constantine and Marinus were then the leading men of Gaeta, and that the town still stood in a dependent relationship to Naples. Their political connection to the Neapolitan ruling world seems likely, and even the use of Greek in their signatures points in that direction. Yet, in 867 the picture changes sharply. The first surviving document written at Gaeta itself, and dated by the rule of Doibilis, presents him as prefect and acting ruler. In that text, he appears in open authority, presiding over a legal dispute involving the Bishop of Gaeta and 2 local inhabitants. Nothing in the evidence clearly ties him to Constantine, Marinus, or the ducal family of Naples. Even his name is highly unusual and barely appears outside the Gaetan material. That sudden appearance raises a serious question. If he did not belong to the established ruling line, how did he rise so quickly, and why did his family remain in power for so long afterward? Some historians once believed that Doibilis owed his success mainly to papal support. That view grew from later evidence showing that he and his son came into possession of important papal lands, and from a chronicler's statement that the Gaetans served the Pope during part of this period. But that explanation does not fully account for the beginning of his power. A more convincing view is that papal grants strengthened a position he had already secured, rather than creating it in the first place. In the late 870s, Pope John VIII seems to have handed over control of the papal patrimonies of Trieto and Fondi to Doibilis, in exchange for ending his ties with the Saracens. This was not an act of friendship. The Pope's letters from these years are full of anger and threats directed at the rulers of the Tyrrhenian coast, who repeatedly dealt with Muslim forces when it suited their interests. One fragment even suggests that Doibilis himself had once been captured by the Saracens and later ransomed with Amalfitan help. That detail is revealing. Before he became one of their partners, he had already been drawn into the unstable world of coastal warfare, ransom, and negotiation. The exact circumstances of the papal grant remain difficult to reconstruct. The original agreements survive only through later copies connected to a boundary dispute, and the narrative sources are incomplete. Still, it is clear that Gaeta was counted among the coastal powers that cooperated at times with Saracen forces and at other times fought against them. There was even a meeting at Trieto in 877 where Pope John attempted to pull the rulers of Gaeta, Amalfi, Naples, Capua, and Salerno away from their Muslim allies through a mixture of threats, money, and concessions. If Doibilis received papal lands during this moment, the Pope was not rewarding loyalty so much as trying to buy distance between Gaeta and the Arabs. Even so, the effort had only limited effect. Not long afterward, more threats of excommunication were issued against leading figures in Gaeta, Amalfi, and Naples. Whatever arrangement had been made, it did not bring stable obedience. An important detail must be kept in mind. Doibilis first appears as ruler of Gaeta in 867, but he is not seen using the title attached to papal land administration until much later. That delay matters. It suggests that the papal connection was not the source of his first rise. The roots of his power must be sought elsewhere. One clue lies in the title Hypatos, which linked Gaetan rulers to a broader political language also found in Naples, Sorrento, and Amalfi. Yet this title did not necessarily mark someone as a dependent ruler. In several cases, it seems to have served more loosely as an honorific used by aristocratic men. That means Doibilis may have adopted prestigious forms without inheriting authority through them. Another clue lies in the contrast between Doibilis and the men who ruled before him. Constantine and his relatives are tied to known noble ancestry. Doibilis is not. His will, drawn up decades later, shows extraordinary quantities of movable wealth, including gold, silver, cloth, bronze, and spices, but says comparatively little about landed property. That profile suggests a man whose strength came not from old aristocratic roots, but from wealth accumulated through commerce. A later text does show that he owned land, but that does not prove he began as a landed noble. In fact, the larger impression is of an outsider who had grown rich first and then entered power. He is absent from earlier witness lists in which the known noble families of Gaeta appear. If he was not born into the local ruling class, then he must have won his way in through money, opportunity, and political calculation. The key to that breakthrough may have been marriage. A close reading of the surviving documents suggests that Doibilis's father-in-law was a man named Bonus. Another Bonus appears as the brother of Constantine, the earlier ruler. The same man is present as a witness at Doibilis's first recorded court. This makes it likely that the two references point to one individual. If that is correct, then the change of power in 866 or 867 was not a total overthrow of the old regime, but a transfer within the wider family circle. Constantine may have died in 866, leaving his son Marinus vulnerable. Bonus, perhaps lacking a son of his own, may have chosen Doibilis as the ideal figure to marry his daughter and assume control. In that case, the takeover at Gaeta would have been part coup and part arranged succession. That interpretation helps explain why Naples did not intervene. If the same ruling network remained outwardly in place, and if the forms of authority remained familiar, then the change may not have appeared radical from outside. But the balance of power had clearly shifted. Bonus may have believed he could use Doibilis and retain influence through him. If so, he misjudged the man. In the very first document from the new regime, Bonus does not stand beside Doibilis as an equal partner. He appears only as a witness. The new ruler had already moved to the centre while the elder figure had been pushed to the side. Whether Doibilis bought support, intimidated rivals, or simply outmaneuvered them, he established himself very quickly as the real master of Gaeta. Such a rise would only have been possible if he had possessed immense liquid wealth. He had to be richer than the local nobles, rich enough either to attract their backing or to overcome their resistance. The contents of his will reinforce that impression. Its emphasis falls heavily on precious, movable goods, far more than on landed estates. That kind of fortune was likely made through long-distance trade. It is difficult to imagine that Gaeta alone, small as it was, could have produced such wealth internally. If it had, the older ruling family would probably have defended itself more successfully. Instead, Doibilis seems to have arrived with resources built beyond the narrow confines of the duchy. Gaeta had a fleet from an early date, and its ships were active in the waters of the Tyrrhenian Sea. In the 9th century, those waters were also crowded with Saracen raiders, merchants, and warbands. A man hoping to build a fortune in that environment may well have needed arrangements with them. The evidence strongly suggests that Doibilis had exactly such ties. Later, chroniclers describe him using Arab allies in his struggles with the Pope and neighbouring powers. One vivid episode tells how papal lands were briefly taken from him and granted to another lord, only for Doibilis to unleash Arab forces in retaliation. The result was humiliation for the Pope and the restoration of the lands. Yet the same episode also shows how dangerous these alliances could be, because the Saracens then turned on Gaeta itself, killing and capturing many of its people. Doibilis relied on them, but he could not fully control them. This relationship with Muslim forces may explain much about his success. In a time when many coastal rulers alternated between fighting the Saracens and bargaining with them, Doibilis seems to have been especially skilled at turning that unstable connection into political power. He could use their presence as protection, as leverage, and perhaps as a source of profit. That combination of wealth and military backing would have made him extremely difficult to oppose. It may also explain why churchmen inside Gaeta accepted him so quickly. The bishop appears before his court in 867 without hesitation. For a clergy living under constant threat of raids and destruction, a ruler who could manage the danger may have seemed preferable to a weaker noble line that could not. Even so, Doibilis' hold on power may not have been secure at once. After his first appearance in 867, the surviving local documents fall almost silent for more than 2 decades. He does appear in papal letters and in outside chronicles during those years, so he was certainly active, but the scarcity of internal documentation may hint at insecurity. He may have spent much of that time dealing with Arab attacks, papal pressure, and threats from neighbouring powers such as Capua. It is also possible that opposition survived inside Gaeta among noble families attached to the Old Order. The documentary dating formulas from this period are revealing. The first act under Doibilis uses his own rule as the basis for dating. Then the evidence reverts to dating by the Byzantine emperors, and only gradually does a mixed formula emerge that names both the emperors and the rulers of Gaeta. Full abandonment of imperial dating would not come until the next generation. That slow transition suggests caution. Doibilis could seize power, but he could not instantly rewrite the political language of legitimacy. He was therefore careful to present himself as part of the established order. His marriage into the older ruling family gave him a foothold in local respectability. He also sought the support of another important clan, descendants of an earlier leader named Christopher. In one revealing act, Doibilis and his son confirmed a land sale originally made by a member of the older ruling family. The gesture mattered. It showed that Doibilis was not merely commanding by force. He was also claiming the right to act within the old aristocratic framework, as though he belonged to it. Again and again, members of established families appear as witnesses in his acts, which suggests that he wanted their approval or at least their visible cooperation. This strategy is also clear in his dealings with another powerful family, later known through a figure named Kampuli. That clan seems to have been tied to the earlier ruling house. In fact, there are signs that Kampuli may have been the grandson of Constantine through Marinus, the very line displaced by Doibilis. If so, then he had an obvious claim to authority. Yet instead of resisting openly, he was drawn into the new order. He bore the title prefect, remained close to the ruling circle, and later married Doibilis' granddaughter. This marriage echoed the earlier union between Doibilis and the daughter of Bonus. The pattern was deliberate. By linking his line to the old rulers through marriage, Doibilis turned potential rivals into relatives and gave his regime an appearance of continuity. Kampuli benefited from this arrangement as well. He received prestigious property, including shares in mills that carried both economic and symbolic value. Such assets were not handed out casually. Their transfer shows that the ruling family was willing to reward acceptance of the new order. If Kampuli really was descended from the displaced line, then his support was especially valuable. It helped neutralize any hereditary claim that could have challenged the Doibilians. Perhaps he had been too young to resist when the transfer of power first occurred. By the time he came fully into view, accommodation may have seemed more profitable than conflict. Through wealth, alliance, and careful social positioning, Doibilis had turned a potentially fragile takeover into a durable dynasty. The church also adjusted to this reality. By the early 9th century, bishops connected to Formia had already taken refuge at Gaeta as Arab pressure intensified along the coast. After Formia was sacked, the bishopric effectively shifted toward Gaeta, even if the memory of the old centre lingered. In this setting, a strong ruler capable of defending the fortress town would have been welcome. The bishop's appearance in Doibilis' court in 867 is an early sign that the local church accepted his authority without open resistance. Over time, the bond between the bishopric and the ruling house would become even stronger. The papal lands of Fondi and Traietto must be understood within this broader picture. The papacy had possessed property in the region for centuries. Earlier, popes had managed and leased estates there through rectors, and Traietto appears to have been the original administrative centre of this papal zone. In fact, before the rise of Doibilis, Traietto seems more important politically than Gaeta itself. Several early documents connected with papal administration point not to the promontory fortress, but to Traietto and its surrounding lands. Gaeta, by contrast, was a more defensible site with stronger ties to Naples. Doibilis' decision to make his base there reflects both military logic and his likely connection to the Neapolitan sphere. Once he took control, he gradually pulled the surrounding territories, including those once centred on Traietto, into a new political order focused on Gaeta. That shift would have long-term consequences. It also helps explain the Pope's decision to negotiate with Doibilis, rather than simply oppose him. The papacy may have concluded that it was better to surrender formal control of certain lands under agreed terms, than to risk losing them entirely to a ruler who was already too powerful to ignore. In that sense, the grants were not marks of papal dominance over Gaeta. They were concessions to political reality. Ironically, those concessions probably strengthened Doibilis at a crucial moment, giving him not only land and title, but also a layer of legitimacy he could display before the local nobility. Yet ties with Naples did not disappear. If anything, they remained significant. Later, evidence suggests continued marriage alliances between the Doibilian family and the ducal house of Naples. One of John's sisters seems to have married into the Neapolitan dynasty. In the next generation, Doibilis II took a Neapolitan wife, and that connection may have helped explain his adoption of the ducal title, which began to replace the older honorifics. Property links also crossed the border between the two duchies. Gaetans owned land in the territory of Naples, and members of Gaetan elite families are found living or acting there. These ties imply more than occasional diplomacy. They point to an ongoing social and political relationship between the two ruling worlds. That relationship may go back even earlier. If the displaced line at Gaeta was originally of Neapolitan origin, then the continuity runs deeper than it first appears. There are hints in the Neapolitan record of a powerful family with names and titles that resemble those seen at Gaeta. One branch even included a man named Campulus. The evidence is not enough for certainty, but it raises the possibility that Gaeta's older rulers and some of Naples' leading aristocrats belong to the same wider network. If that is true, then Gaeta was never quite as isolated or independent as it sometimes appears. Its institutions, titles, and elite culture may have been shaped to a large degree by Naples. Naples itself offers a useful comparison. There too, power in this period came to be concentrated within one family. The decisive figure was Sergius I, who secured the duchy in the mid-9th century after a period of instability. Like Doibilis, he strengthened his position by associating his son in power during his own lifetime. He also placed relatives in major church offices, binding secular rule and ecclesiastical influence closely together. In Naples, that closeness ran so deep that some rulers themselves combined ducal and episcopal authority. The family thus built continuity not only through succession but through a wider network of offices and alliances. The Duchy of Naples, however, faced constant pressure from the same unstable world that shaped Gaeta. Saracen activity remained a defining factor. Internal coups, blinding of rivals, papal condemnation, and shifting alliances all marked Neapolitan politics in the late 9th century. Even bishops who took power behaved much like secular princes, negotiating, fighting, and manoeuvring with little regard for ideal religious conduct. Marriages linked Naples to Capua, to Rome, and to Gaeta, showing how deeply the duchy was tied into the politics of southern Italy. Its rulers were not provincial figures. They acted within a wide and competitive arena. Amalfi followed a similar path, though in its own way. It gradually moved away from Neapolitan control during the 9th century and developed under a series of strong families. Here too one sees a movement from local leadership toward hereditary rule. Prefects first dominated the city. Then gradually rulers adopted the ducal title as their authority hardened into dynastic form. Amalfi's leaders, like those of Gaeta and Naples, balanced relations with Lombard neighbours, the papacy, and Muslim powers across the sea. Their choices were often guided less by ideology than by practical interest, especially trade. In this respect, Amalfi's ruling house resembled Doibilis's world very closely. Commercial wealth, maritime skill, and flexible diplomacy could build political power just as effectively as noble ancestry. Taken together, these patterns show that Gaeta was not an isolated curiosity, but part of a broader transformation along the Tyrrhenian coast. Yet the rise of Doibilis still stands out for its boldness. He seems to have begun not as an unquestioned noble heir, but as a wealthy and highly capable outsider who entered the ruling circle through marriage, seized an opening at the right moment, and then used every available tool to keep what he had won. He cultivated old families while intimidating them. He negotiated with the Pope while dealing with the Saracens. He embraced established titles while gradually reshaping the meaning of power in Gaeta. By the time his dynasty was firmly rooted, what may have started as a risky seizure of control had become a recognized political order. That is what makes his story so important. It reveals how authority could be created in a world where legal structures were weak, dynastic habits were still forming, and military protection mattered as much as inherited right. In such a world, the man who could gather wealth, secure allies, marry strategically, and survive the dangerous politics of coast and sea could turn himself into a ruler. Doibilis did exactly that. His rise was not clean, lawful, or gentle, but it was effective, and its effects lasted for generations. The moment when Manso briefly seized control of Salerno did not last long. The rightful prince, Gesolf, soon returned with the support of Pandolf of Capua. In order to secure the future of the principality, Gesolf named Pandolf's son as his heir. Yet Manso had not abandoned his ambitions. His goal had always been greater influence beyond Amalfi itself. When he associated his son John in power in the late 970s, the dynasty was preparing for future opportunities. That opportunity arrived sooner than expected. When Pandolf died in 981, the political balance in southern Italy shifted suddenly. Manso moved quickly and took control of Salerno. For 2 years he ruled there as prince. His success, however, did not last. In 983, a coup removed him from power. During the upheaval, Manso's son, John, was captured and held as a hostage. He remained in captivity for several years before finally being released, near the end of the decade. Despite this setback, John continued to appear in official Amalfitan dating formulas beside his father, which suggests that the ruling family still claimed authority even during this period of uncertainty. John's wife, Regalis, who came from a Lombard background, provides an interesting glimpse into the situation. In the mid-1980s, she issued a document in which she donated land. The text makes no reference to John's imprisonment. This silence may reflect the political sensitivity of the moment. Acknowledging the captivity of a ruling duke would have weakened the authority of the dynasty. Instead, the document presents the family as though its authority remained intact. At the same time, another branch of the ruling house attempted to assert its own influence. Manso's brother, Adolpherius, briefly seized power in Amalfi and even associated his own son with him as co-ruler. The political landscape of the city became extremely unstable. A remarkable document from the late 980s reveals the extent of the confusion. In it, several members of the ruling family all claimed authority at once. Manso, John, Adolpherius, and 2 other brothers, Leos and Adamarius, were all listed together as rulers of Amalfi in a donation made to the Church of St. Lawrence. The document reflects a moment when power was fragmented and contested among members of the same dynasty. Not long afterward, the situation stabilized again. By the end of the decade, the struggle had resolved in favor of Manso and his son John. They continued to govern Amalfi together into the early 11th century. Adolpherius did not disappear entirely from the record, however. Documents show him still issuing acts in the city several years later. Yet the aftermath of his attempt to seize power may have made Amalfi an uncomfortable place for his family. By the early 11th century, his widow and children had settled in Naples. Even there, they continued to style themselves with the titles of Duke and Duchess, preserving the memory of their former position. The death of Manso in the early 11th century marked the end of a long and active political career. But the succession had already been secured. Evidence suggests that by the beginning of the new century, 3 generations of the ruling family were formally acknowledged in official dating formulas. Manso himself, his son John, and his young grandson Sergius all appeared together in the same document. Such formulas were more than ceremonial. They demonstrated that the dynasty had successfully established continuity from one generation to the next. John ruled for 2 more years after his father's death before passing authority peacefully to his son Sergius. The transition was unusually smooth for a period often marked by coups and rivalries. John appears to have had another son named Riso, yet the younger branch of the family didn't receive the ducal title. Even so, exclusion from the ruling position didn't prevent them from acquiring considerable wealth. A document from the early 11th century reveals that the widow of Riso's son sold a piece of land in the plain of Amalfi for an enormous sum of money. The price shows just how valuable property in the region had become. The buyer was a relative connected to the Salernitan aristocracy, which hints at further family ties between Amalfi and the Lombard elites of the mainland. Evidence suggests that marriages between the Amalfitan ruling house and Salernitan noble families had taken place, even though the details are no longer clearly visible. Connections with other Lombard states are easier to trace. Sergius, who succeeded John, strengthened his political alliances through marriage to Maria, a sister of the powerful prince Pandulf of Capua. The couple's son John was soon associated with his father in power, continuing the pattern that had defined Amalfitane rule for generations. The stability achieved by the dynasty did not last long. In the late 1020s, a new crisis erupted when Pandulf extended his influence across the region and gained control of Naples. Faced with this expansion of power, Sergius and his son John fled the city and sought refuge in Constantinople. Their departure left Maria and another son, Manso, to govern Amalfi. The arrangement did not hold for long. John eventually returned and managed to capture both his mother and brother, declaring himself the sole ruler of the city. Even this victory proved temporary. A few years later, Maria and Manso regained control, forcing John and his son Sergius into exile again. This time, they found safety in Naples, where political circumstances had changed and support was available. Meanwhile, the balance of power in southern Italy continued to shift. The rise of the Salernitan prince Guaimarius transformed the situation once more. Without strong external allies, Maria and Manso were overthrown again, and John and Sergius returned to Amalfi. Their triumph did not end the turmoil. Manso was blinded in the struggle, a punishment often used in the politics of the period to remove rivals without killing them. Yet Maria still retained a formal place in government, appearing in official dating clauses even after the coup. The region remained unstable as larger powers competed for influence. When Guaimarius's authority expanded rapidly across southern Italy, John and Sergius once again withdrew into exile, returning to Constantinople for safety. For a time, Amalfi came directly under the control of Guaimarius. Later, he ruled indirectly by installing the blinded Manso as a puppet leader. In a final gesture of loyalty to his patron, Manso even named a son after Guaimarius and associated the boy in power. The situation eventually provoked resistance within the city. After several years of tension, a revolt broke out that expelled both Guaimarius's representatives and the puppet ruler. John and his son Sergius were restored to power. Their return marked the final recovery of the dynasty's authority before a new force arrived in southern Italy. In the following decades, the Normans would begin to reshape the political landscape of the entire region. The intertwined histories of the ruling families of Naples, Gaeta, and Amalfi reveal how closely connected the three duchies were. None of them developed in isolation. Their rulers repeatedly interacted with one another through alliances, rivalries, and especially marriage. Dynastic unions were one of the most reliable ways to strengthen political support in a world where formal institutions were weak. It is very likely that more of these marriages occurred than can now be detected in surviving documents. Family structure itself played a crucial role in the success or failure of these ruling houses. The Doibilian dynasty of Gaeta expanded rapidly through numerous marriages and a large number of descendants, allowing it to spread influence widely. In Amalfi, the earlier ruling families seem to have been smaller, which may have made them more vulnerable when crises erupted. In Naples, the ducal house also relied heavily on strategic placement of relatives in important positions. Even with only a few sons, the family was able to secure its authority by distributing power carefully. Another striking pattern is the way moments of instability often appeared across the duchies at the same time. When Naples struggled with internal conflict in the early 9th century, Amalfi drifted away from its influence. Later, when a new generation of rulers emerged in Naples, fresh dynasties also rose in both Amalfi and Gaeta. By the middle of the 10th century, all three cities had adopted the title of duke for their rulers. At roughly the same time, they all faced pressure from the Lombard powers of Capua and Salerno. Despite their independence, the rulers of these coastal states continued to employ Byzantine titles and honours. Constantinople maintained a symbolic connection with the region by granting prestigious ranks to local leaders. For the dukes themselves, these titles provided an additional source of legitimacy. A Byzantine honour suggested that their authority had imperial recognition, even if the empire had little real control over events in southern Italy. On rare occasions, the connection had practical value, when political disasters forced Amalfitan rulers into exile. Constantinople could offer them protection. Yet the empire lacked the power to intervene decisively in their restoration. In Gaeta, ownership of mills appears to have been a tightly controlled privilege. During the period when the Doibilian family dominated the city, records consistently show that only members of this ruling clan possessed shares in the local mills. The pattern changed only after their authority in Gaeta collapsed in 1032. Once their political control ended, other individuals began to appear among the owners of milling facilities. This shift strongly suggests that the Doibilians had previously maintained a near monopoly over these valuable installations. Mills were not ordinary pieces of property. Throughout the 10th and 11th centuries, they commanded prices that far exceeded the value of most agricultural land. A comparison from the mid-11th century illustrates this clearly. In one recorded transaction, a count sold a portion of the mill, known as maiore, for £24 of silver. At roughly the same time, an enormous tract of fertile grain-producing land could be purchased for the same amount. In fact, the price paid for a single mill share could rival the value of hundreds of units of productive farmland. The extraordinary worth of mills becomes even clearer when compared with other transactions of the period. Around the same decades, a man who had been considered the leading candidate for the bishopric of Gaeta abandoned his claim to the office in exchange for a payment of only £20 of silver. In other words, the price of a portion of a mill could surpass the compensation offered for relinquishing one of the highest ecclesiastical offices in the region. Evidence from elsewhere in Italy confirms that mills were generally expensive, though the prices recorded in southern coastal cities were particularly striking. In Amalfi during the early 11th century, even a relatively small share in a mill could command a remarkable price. By contrast, vineyards, open fields, and even valuable coastal plots of land sold for only a fraction of that amount. Further north, similar patterns can be observed in the countryside around Milan. There too, mills tended to cost several times more than ordinary farmland. The difference between the value of milling installations and agricultural plots was therefore a widespread phenomenon, though in some southern regions the gap appears to have been especially dramatic. One explanation offered by historians is that mills required significant capital to construct and maintain. Wealthy merchants or landowners may have viewed them as profitable investments. Yet this explanation alone cannot fully account for their extraordinary prices. Many of the mills along the Tyrrhenian coast were probably modest structures powered by horizontal water wheels, and such mechanisms were not particularly complex or expensive to build. Why, then, were mills so valuable? Part of the answer may lie in how they were owned and divided. In the northern parts of Italy, mills were sometimes divided into shares, but even then the divisions were relatively large. In the coastal duchies of the south, however, ownership could be fragmented into extremely small portions. Shares might represent only a few days of annual operation. This high degree of subdivision suggests that mills were scarce resources, and scarcity naturally drove up their value. Geography also played a role. The territories of Gaeta and Amalfi were limited in size and dominated by limestone terrain. Reliable streams suitable for powering mills were therefore relatively rare. Only a handful of locations provided the necessary water flow, which meant that the number of viable mill sites was restricted. Even so, the scarcity of mills cannot entirely explain the social patterns surrounding them. In both Gaeta and Amalfi, ownership appears to have been limited, almost exclusively, to wealthy individuals and powerful institutions. Ordinary farmers rarely owned mills directly. Instead, they likely depended on the facilities controlled by the elite. This exclusivity raises the possibility that mills carried not only economic value, but also social prestige. Possessing a share in a mill may have been a visible marker of wealth and status. If this interpretation is correct, the Doibilian family's tight control over milling installations in Gaeta becomes easier to understand. Their monopoly was not merely about income. It also reinforced their standing as the dominant family of the region. There are signs that the rulers of Gaeta deliberately maintained strict oversight of milling activity, even within their own family. Early in the 10th century, one duke left a horse-powered mill to a relative, but specifically forbade any expansion that might increase its production capacity. In another case, a daughter received a share of a mill under the condition that she would not use any other facility. These restrictions reveal a clear intention to regulate how grain was processed and where it could be milled. The physical placement of the mills also seems to have been carefully planned. Several were located beside important bridges or along major travel routes. Such locations ensured easy access for farmers, bringing their grain while also maximizing the amount of grain that could be processed. One example mentions a mill positioned beside a bridge, where travelers frequently crossed a river, a placement that likely guaranteed constant activity. Despite their value, mills were almost never granted outside the ruling family. For generations, transfers of ownership remained confined to Doibilian relatives. Only two exceptions are known. The first occurred in the mid-10th century, when a duke left a share of a mill to a woman who had formerly been enslaved. Even this apparent act of generosity probably did not remove the property from the wider influence of the ruling household. Freed individuals often remained closely tied to their former masters and their families. The second exception took place during a moment of political crisis in the 11th century. By that time, the Doibilians had already lost control of Gaeta to external forces. In a desperate attempt to regain support, a member of the family granted a share of a mill to two allies in return for their services. The decision may have been intended to secure loyalty in a period of intense instability. Yet such measures ultimately failed, and rival rulers soon established their authority in the city. Patterns similar to those seen in Gaeta appear elsewhere along the Tyrrhenian coast. In Amalfi, members of the ruling family also possessed milling shares and occasionally transferred them to important religious figures. The rulers of Naples likewise owned mills during the same period, although the evidence suggests that monopolization there was less rigid. In larger territories where more rivers and streams were available, control over milling facilities may have been harder to maintain. Water resources themselves were another crucial element of power. Control over rivers and channels effectively meant control over milling. In one dispute from the early 11th century, the ruler of Gaeta intervened in a conflict over a channel constructed to direct water toward a mill. The right to divert water was equivalent to the right to operate the mill itself, making such decisions highly significant. Rulers also exercised authority over fishing rights and other resources connected to rivers and lakes. Grants of fishing privileges appear in several documents. Such concessions could bring substantial income, reinforcing the economic power of the ruling elite. At the same time that their public lands gradually diminished, the rulers of Gaeta remained careful to protect their privately owned estates. Transactions involving these properties were usually confined to members of the family. Land might be granted to sons, exchanged among relatives, or divided among heirs, but it rarely left the family circle. The Doibilian clan was large, extending well beyond the immediate line of dukes. Even minor branches possessed significant wealth. One surviving testament from the early 11th century reveals an impressive collection of lands stretching across a wide area of the duchy. Alongside agricultural estates, the owner listed large quantities of gold, silver, fine fabrics, and enslaved servants. Interestingly, daughters in such wills often received wealth in movable goods, rather than large tracts of land. This strategy prevented valuable estates from passing outside the family through marriage. By preserving land within the male line, the family attempted to maintain its economic foundation. Similar patterns of property management appear in Amalfi. There, the ruling family also possessed both public and private lands, though evidence suggests that their holdings were sometimes scattered along the edges of their territory. Transactions involving land on nearby islands and coastal districts reveal careful attention to boundaries and ownership rights. In Naples, the ruling dynasty also held estates in numerous locations around the city and its surrounding countryside. Although the surviving documentation is limited, it indicates that the ducal family controlled lands across several districts. Some evidence even suggests that the coastal zone of Naples may have been dominated by the ducal palace complex itself. Across all three cities, the preservation of family unity played a crucial role in maintaining political power. Land was divided among heirs, yet the support of the entire family was essential to sustain a ruling dynasty. Only one member might hold the title of duke, but his relatives shared in the wealth and influence that came with power. Their cooperation strengthened the dynasty's position. Religious patronage formed another essential pillar of authority. Medieval rulers relied heavily on the support of the church. By founding monasteries, donating land, and protecting ecclesiastical institutions, they gained both spiritual legitimacy and political allies. In Amalfi, the ruling family frequently supported churches, providing mills, land, and water rights to religious institutions. In Naples, similar patterns can be seen. Dukes donated churches, confirmed monastic privileges, and occasionally exchanged valuable properties with major monasteries. The rulers of Gaeta followed the same path. One of the earliest members of the dynasty established a prominent church dedicated to St. Michael and enriched it with lands and a mill. The same ruler financed elaborate decoration for another church in the city, spending an impressive sum on construction and sacred objects. These acts of generosity were intended not only to honor religious institutions, but also to demonstrate the ruler's prestige. Over time, several churches emerged as favored recipients of ducal patronage. Some served as family foundations closely tied to the ruling dynasty, while others represented important ecclesiastical centres, whose support could reinforce political authority. Gifts of land and privileges helped secure loyalty and spiritual endorsement. Bishops also played a critical role in this relationship between church and ruler. In Gaeta, the bishops quickly recognized the authority of the new ruling family and cooperated with them in property transactions. Members of the ducal household even held important clerical offices within the church hierarchy. At times, however, tensions arose. Disputes over land occasionally placed bishops and members of the ruling family on opposite sides. In such cases, political calculations sometimes outweighed family loyalty. Maintaining the goodwill of the church remained a priority for the rulers. In one notable development, a younger son of the ducal family eventually became Bishop of Gaeta. By placing a family member in this powerful position, the ruling house hoped to secure stronger influence over the city's religious leadership. The strategy proved effective. The bishop remained in office for decades, surviving even the fall of his family's political authority. Judicial authority formed yet another component of ducal power. From an early stage, the rulers of Gaeta presided over disputes brought before their court. Litigants recognized their authority and accepted their role as arbiters. Court cases recorded in surviving documents often involved disputes over land or property. Sometimes, the duke delivered a clear decision. In other cases, compromises were arranged that divided the contested property between the parties. When members of the ruling family themselves became involved in disputes, settlements were often negotiated directly between the participants. Without a higher authority to appeal to, compromise became the most practical solution. In later years, however, local elites sometimes turned to assemblies of respected citizens, rather than to the duke himself. These groups of prominent men could act as mediators, suggesting that the process of dispute resolution was evolving. A similar situation existed in Naples and Amalfi. Dukes occasionally presided over disputes, particularly those involving important families or religious institutions. Yet their role may have been more ceremonial than decisive. In some cases, simply bringing the parties before the duke encouraged them to reach a settlement on their own. Across these coastal duchies, many conflicts were likely resolved privately, without ever reaching a formal court. Neighbours, relatives, or local leaders may have mediated disagreements long before official proceedings became necessary. The surviving records, therefore, reveal only a small portion of the disputes that must have occurred. Nevertheless, they show that the authority to preside over legal cases was widely recognized as a key aspect of rulership. By controlling land, supporting the church, maintaining family unity, and exercising judicial authority, the rulers of these coastal cities constructed a durable system of power. Even in small territories, these interconnected foundations allowed ruling families to dominate political life for generations. In the 10th century, the rulers of the coastal city of Gaeta controlled a small but active political world along the Tyrrhenian Sea. Yet the surviving documents reveal surprisingly little about how these rulers actually managed public finances. Most written records from this period focus on land sales, leases, and family property arrangements rather than government administration. Because of this, historians must piece together the financial system indirectly. One of the few clues comes from the ruling family known as the Doibilians. Their actions suggest that they gradually absorbed control over profitable public resources. Facilities such as mills appear to have been monopolized by the ducal household, which implies that other forms of revenue, such as market taxes, harbour fees, or duties on shipping, may also have been quietly brought under their authority. Some wills from important figures connected to the ruling circle hint at another economic dimension. Individuals such as Doibilis I, Doibilis II, and Gregory, the son of Leo the Prefect, owned luxury goods that had clearly arrived through maritime trade. These objects suggest that Gaeta participated in long-distance commerce that brought valuable products from the Mediterranean world into the city. However, surviving documents never show the rulers themselves organizing these imports directly. The evidence only reveals their interest in such goods, once they had already reached Gaeta. Whether the ducal family controlled the trade itself or simply taxed it when it passed through their ports remains uncertain. A similar problem appears in the records from nearby Naples. It seems unlikely that the Neapolitan dukes monopolized commercial activity in the same way that the rulers of Gaeta may have done. Even so, one surviving document from the end of the 10th century offers a glimpse of how public revenue might have been collected. In that document, a duke granted a monastery the right to send its ships wherever the abbot wished, and to hire foreign sailors if necessary. The wording strongly suggests that shipping itself was normally under ducal supervision. Anyone wishing to sail from the city's harbour or land goods along its coast probably had to pay for that privilege. This idea becomes even more convincing when the physical layout of Naples is considered. The ducal palace complex seems to have occupied most of the city's waterfront, which would have allowed the rulers to watch and regulate maritime traffic very closely. Another later record shows how the rulers could also release individuals or institutions from certain public obligations. In one case, a duke transferred a church from one religious institution to another and freed it from the various services normally owed to the state. These duties likely included labour obligations or other forms of public service demanded by the government. Control over water systems, city walls, towers and gates also appears to have belonged to the ducal administration. By the 12th century, even the right to collect fees at the city gates had been granted to private families. Giving such profitable responsibilities to loyal supporters may have been a way for the dukes to strengthen alliances with influential local households. The rulers of Naples are frequently visible in another role as well. Many surviving documents show them giving formal approval to property transactions carried out by their subjects. Nearly all of these cases involve the sale or transfer of land. In one example, the duke intervened because the owner of the property was still a minor and therefore needed protection under the law. Situations like this could become financially advantageous for the ruler, since supervising the affairs of young heirs allowed the ducal government to exercise temporary control over their estates. The Duchy of Amalfi offers only a brief glimpse into similar fiscal practices. One rare reference from the early 11th century shows a duke excusing a relative from taxes owed on a piece of land she had purchased. The payment due to the treasury was not money, but agricultural goods, wine, vegetables, sheep, and birds. This kind of payment suggests a very simple fiscal structure. The duchy's economy still relied heavily on agricultural production, rather than on a complex bureaucratic tax system. Even so, Amalfi's neighbours do not appear to have been much more sophisticated at the time. Across the three Tyrrhenian duchies, Gaeta, Naples, and Amalfi, the duke clearly stood at the centre of political power, yet the records provide only scattered details about what the rulers actually did on a daily basis. One striking feature is the absence of new laws issued by these governments. This may reflect the lingering idea that the duchies remained technically part of the Byzantine world and therefore still followed imperial law. Documents from the period continue to mention Roman legal traditions, suggesting that people still believed they lived within a wider legal system inherited from the empire. The military situation in these coastal states is also somewhat unclear. The documents rarely mention large numbers of soldiers. However, this absence probably reflects the nature of the records rather than the real strength of the armies. In Naples, for example, some citizens identified as mounted warriors appear in documents connected to border regions near the Lombard Principality of Capua. These men likely defended their own lands and local communities. Instead of being directly commanded by the Duke, they protected their personal property and the territory around it. As a result, power over certain frontier areas may have rested partly in the hands of these local elites. The gradual transfer of authority from central rulers to regional figures would become more visible in the following century. In Gaeta especially, the dukes shared power with local counts, who administered smaller territories within the duchy. This arrangement eventually weakened central authority. When powerful local families began to pursue their own ambitions, the balance between the duke and the nobility became increasingly unstable. Despite their growing independence, the three duchies never completely severed their symbolic ties with the Byzantine Empire. The way documents were dated provides an important clue. Some rulers briefly experimented with dating charters according to their own reigns, which would have signalled a clear claim to independence. Yet others returned to using the regnal years of the Byzantine emperor. Eventually, the rulers of Gaeta abandoned imperial dating when they began openly calling themselves dukes. Amalfi had fewer concerns about this issue, possibly because it had already experienced a period under Lombard control before becoming independent. Naples, however, continued to date documents by the emperor's reign for centuries. The city maintained strong administrative traditions and preserved many old ceremonial habits, even when they had little practical meaning. Coinage offers another way to observe these lingering connections. The documents show that many types of gold and silver coins circulated in the region, but accounting was often carried out using the Byzantine gold solidus as a standard unit. When looking at the bronze coins used in everyday life, however, a different picture appears. Gaeta minted coins that displayed the name of the ruling duke along with the image of the city's patron saint. Naples produced similar bronze coins, though it also issued silver coins that continued to show the Byzantine emperor rather than the local ruler. Amalfi followed a different path, eventually producing gold coins modelled on Islamic currency used in Mediterranean trade. The duchies also continued to use honorific titles derived from Byzantine court traditions. Documents from Amalfi and Gaeta show rulers and important citizens carrying titles granted by the emperor. Naples, interestingly, displays far fewer examples of these honours. This contrast may actually reflect political circumstances. Titles could serve as tools of diplomacy, allowing the Byzantine government to maintain influence over regions that might otherwise drift away from imperial authority. Amalfi, which had strong trading connections across the Mediterranean and sometimes cooperated with Arab merchants, may have received these honours as a way to reinforce loyalty to Byzantium. In contrast, Naples remained culturally close to the Byzantine world and may not have required the same level of symbolic encouragement. As time passed and memories of earlier imperial favours faded, the number of title holders gradually declined in Gaeta as well. Taken together, the evidence paints a picture of relatively simple political systems in these coastal states during the 10th century. Administrative institutions were weak, and formal bureaucratic offices are almost entirely absent from the documents. Instead, power centered on ruling families whose authority depended on personal relationships, inherited land, and the cooperation of local elites. Public and private property often blended together, and the boundaries between state resources and family wealth were not clearly defined. The dukes ruled largely through dynastic legitimacy rather than through elaborate administrative structures. Their position was not formally confirmed by the Byzantine Emperor or by the Church, although both institutions could provide useful support. In practice, governing these small states often resembled managing a large family enterprise rather than running a structured government. Even so, the dukes could never exercise power alone. The support of influential noble families remained essential. These families owned land, commanded local influence, and participated in political alliances that shaped the future of the duchy. Their cooperation, or their opposition, could determine whether a ruling dynasty survived or collapsed. Understanding how these families operated provides a deeper insight into how power truly functioned within the small but dynamic world of southern Italy's coastal duchies. During the early 11th century, an important development took place in the lands associated with the Kampuli family. Around the year 1020, a man named Mirus, the son of John, confirmed a significant land donation that he had made to three brothers, Doibilis, Leo, and John of the Caracci family. The confirmation was given by his grandfather, another Mirus, who was the son of Campulus the prefect. The estates involved in the transfer were scattered across several locations, including Castro Argento, Tremonsuoli, Tisanellum in the territory of Calvi, Massa, and Calabriti near Tisanellum. At first glance, these may have been only small parcels of land, distributed across different districts. Yet the fact that the younger Mirus sought the approval of his elderly grandfather suggests that the transaction carried more weight than a simple family arrangement. It indicates that the property involved was meaningful enough to require the authority of the senior figure of the clan. The motivation behind the transfer may lie in the political culture of the time. Noble families did not maintain their influence through land alone. Generosity toward allies was a key tool for building loyalty and expanding networks of support. Just as the Dukes of Gaeta strengthened their position by granting lands to trusted followers, powerful noble families were expected to act in a similar way. The Kampuli, whose lineage stretched back long before the rise of the Doibilian dynasty, likely understood the importance of cultivating a circle of loyal supporters. One possible explanation is that the Kampuli were strengthening their relationship with the Caracci family. The Caracci do not appear frequently in the earlier records under that name, which suggests that they may have been a family of more modest standing, whose rise was tied to the patronage of the Kampuli. If this was the case, the grant of land could have been a deliberate attempt to establish them as dependable allies within the political landscape of the duchy. Despite this strengthening of alliances, there is no indication that the Kampuli were trying to challenge the authority of the ruling Doibilian family. On the contrary, their history shows continued cooperation with the Dukes of Gaeta, even during moments of political tension. Their relationship with the ruling dynasty appears to have been one of mutual benefit rather than rivalry. Evidence of this cooperation can be seen later in the century. In 1042, Duke Leo II granted the entire mill known as Maiore to Marinus, the son of Campulus, along with another man named Gregory. The grant was explicitly made as a reward for their service. Marinus was already known as a loyal supporter of the dynasty, having witnessed the will of Duke John III decades earlier. His continued prominence shows that the Doibilians still considered the Kampuli valuable allies. The influence of the Kampuli family extended well beyond the final years of the Doibilian dynasty. Even after the decline of that ruling house, members of the clan remained visible in the records of the region. Sergius, another descendant of Campulus, possessed extensive landed property and left a substantial estate in his testament during the late 11th century. His holdings demonstrate that the wealth accumulated by the family had been preserved across several generations. Other members of the clan also remained active in the political and social life of the duchy. One, Campulus, the son of John, appears as a witness to a document issued by Duchess Maria and her son, Duke Atenulf II, during the 1060s. He continued to appear in several transactions involving other noble families in the region. Such appearances reveal that the Kampuli still held a respected position among the aristocracy of Gaeta. Land ownership provides further clues about their continued influence. One document suggests that Campulus owned property in the territory of Formia, next to land sold by his sister-in-law, Gemma, to the abbot of St. Erasmus. The connections revealed in these transactions illustrate the complex web of relationships linking noble families, monasteries, and political authorities. Gemma's own family remained present in the records as well. Her son Leo appears as a witness to several documents extending into the final decades of the 11th century. The continued visibility of these individuals suggests that the broader network of families connected to the Kampuli remained active long after the fall of the Doibilian dynasty. The enduring strength of the Kampuli clan can largely be explained by their independence. Although they received gifts of land from the Dukes of Gaeta, their history and wealth did not begin with the Doibilian rulers. Their lineage extended further back into the earlier history of the region. This meant that their prosperity did not depend entirely on the favour of the ruling dynasty. Because of this independence, the Kampuli were able to survive political changes that destroyed other families. When the Doibilians eventually disappeared from power, many of the aristocrats who had relied on them lost their influence. The Kampuli, however, possessed their own resources and alliances, allowing them to remain an important presence within the duchy. The Carracci family appears to have been one of the groups that benefited from Kampuli patronage. Before the land transfer of 1020, they are scarcely mentioned in the surviving records. Their later prominence suggests that they may have risen in status through the support of the Kampuli household. Once established, however, the Carracci became active participants in the political life of the region throughout the 11th and even into the 12th century. Families of a similar social level are much harder to trace in the documents. Their transactions were probably fewer and less likely to be recorded, especially if their activities were closely tied to the interests of their patrons. For this reason, the historical record tends to highlight the larger noble houses, while leaving the identities of their dependents largely in shadow. The Kampuli and the Cristofori families are particularly well documented, perhaps because their origins stretch back to the period before the rise of the Doibilian rulers. This earlier start may have allowed them to accumulate greater wealth than many of their contemporaries during the 10th century. Alongside these powerful clans, there were also smaller landowners, whose families can be traced across only a few generations. These individuals may represent the more typical level of noble society under the Doibilian dukes. One example is the family associated with a man known as Count Gaetanus. Around the middle of the 10th century, he received a portion of publicly owned farmland in the district of Marana from the ruling dukes. His presence in the records again several years later as a witness to a ducal document shows that he remained connected to the political life of the duchy. The family continued into the next generation. Toward the end of the century, a younger Gaetanus sold land located in the valley of the Alciente River below Marana. The transaction reveals both the family's continued presence in the region and the way land circulated among the local aristocracy. One of the witnesses to this sale appears under the name Maria de Coronella. The presence of a female witness is unusual in the surviving records of Gaeta during this period. Because women rarely appear in such lists, it is possible that the name recorded in the document may actually refer to a man whose name was miswritten. A figure known as Marinus, the son of John Coronella, appears elsewhere around the same time and may have been the individual involved. This Marinus later appears performing several significant roles, including acting as trustee and executor of a will. At the beginning of the 11th century, he sold land in a place called Grozanu. A later court case reveals that he had once received property from Duchess Emilia near the mills known as Maiore and St. George. In an unusual gesture, he transferred this land to a slave named Petrocurso. Later records mention a Marinus Coronella, who is described as a nobleman of Gaeta and who participated in several legal disputes during the mid-11th century. Whether this is the same individual as the earlier Marinus cannot be determined with certainty, but the possibility highlights the limitations of the surviving evidence. Another member of the Coronella family played an even more prominent role in the politics of the duchy. Gregory, also the son of John Coronella, used his wealth to support a candidate in the contest for the bishopric of Gaeta during the mid-11th century. His involvement illustrates how members of noble families could influence both secular and ecclesiastical affairs. Despite these glimpses of their activities, the information preserved about families such as the Gaetani and the Coronellas is extremely limited when compared with the more thoroughly documented Kampuli and Cristoferi clans. This disparity raises important questions about the survival of records and about the relationship between noble families and the ruling dynasty. It is not necessarily true that association with the Doibilian dukes guaranteed wealth or political prominence. Some families maintained influence through their own resources and connections rather than through direct dependence on the rulers. Another group that appears frequently in the records consists of individuals who served as witnesses in ducal transactions. Many of these men cannot be directly linked to large estates or prominent family lineages, yet their repeated presence in official documents suggests that they held a recognized place within the social hierarchy of the city. By examining the witness lists attached to ducal charters, a clearer picture of Gaeta's aristocratic society begins to emerge. Alongside the well-known noble families, there appear dozens of individuals whose identities are otherwise obscure. More than 80 different names appear in these lists during the 10th century. Only a minority of these individuals can be confirmed as landowners through other documents. This does not necessarily mean that the rest lacked property. Instead, it reflects the uneven nature of the surviving evidence. Among these witnesses are members of families that had already held influence before the rise of the Doibilian dynasty. Their participation in the new regime suggests that the transition of power in Gaeta did not completely displace the earlier elite. One such figure was Bonus, the son of Count Anatolius. His presence as a witness in an early document issued by Doibilis I symbolized the acceptance of the new ruler by members of the previous aristocracy. This gesture helped legitimize the new political order. Other members of the Anatolii lineage continued to appear in documents over the following decades. Their names can be traced through several generations, indicating that the family maintained a role in the public life of Gaeta even after the shift in power. Another family with roots reaching back into the earlier period was the Agnelli. They had appeared in records during the early 9th century, but disappeared from the documentation for nearly a century. When they re-emerged, they were once again associated with the ruling authorities of the city. Members of the Agnelli appear as witnesses in several important documents issued by the dukes. Their repeated presence suggests that they retained a certain prestige derived from their earlier status. Yet the evidence also hints that their position may have declined over time. Earlier members of the family had used noble titles, while later generations appear without such distinctions. This change may reflect a gradual loss of status during the 10th century. A different example is provided by the Mori family. Unlike the older noble houses, the Mori appear to have risen to prominence during the height of Doibilian rule rather than before it. The earliest known member of the family, Mauro, appears in several ducal documents during the late 10th century as a witness. His repeated presence suggests that he had entered the circle of individuals closely connected with the ruling dynasty. His loyalty appears to have been rewarded. Around the year 980, he and his wife received a grant of public land from the dukes. This gift demonstrates how the rulers could elevate individuals of relatively modest background by incorporating them into their network of supporters. Mauro's sons continued this relationship with the ruling family. One of them appeared in legal disputes involving the Bishop of Gaeta, while the other, Mastulus, became particularly active in the political life of the duchy. Mastulus witnessed transactions involving members of the ruling family and prominent noble houses. His activities brought him into contact with several of the most influential families of Gaeta. Over time, he even adopted the title Magnificus, a designation that suggested elevated social standing. Later references show that Mastulus had a son named Bernard, who served as an advocate for a church strongly supported by the ruling dynasty. Another descendant became a priest, illustrating how the family maintained connections with both secular and ecclesiastical institutions. The story of the Mori family demonstrates that the aristocratic society of Gaeta was more complex than a simple list of landowning families might suggest. Some individuals achieved influence through service to the ruling dynasty rather than through inherited wealth. In addition to the families that can be identified, dozens of other individuals appear only once or twice as witnesses in ducal documents. This pattern suggests that the rulers did not rely on a fixed court of advisors or supporters. Instead, the group of witnesses was fluid, changing from one transaction to another. Occasionally, individuals from outside Gaeta also appear in these lists. One early document includes a witness from Amalfi, showing that connections between the coastal cities were common. Even so, certain patterns emerge. Members of older noble families frequently appear together in witness lists, suggesting that long-established aristocratic networks continue to operate beneath the surface of the new political order. In this way, the rise of the Doibilian dynasty did not completely transform the social structure of Gaeta. Instead, the new rulers worked within an existing aristocratic framework, incorporating some families while elevating others through patronage. For the rulers and leading families of the Tyrrhenian duchies, maintaining close ties with the church was more than an expression of faith. It was a powerful way to strengthen authority, display prestige, and reinforce social standing. The dukes of coastal cities understood that cooperation with religious institutions enhanced their legitimacy. Noble families adopted the same approach, seeking recognition and influence through their relationships with the church. In the Duchy of Gaeta, the pattern is particularly clear. The most prominent families rarely dealt with small or obscure religious establishments. Instead, their transactions concentrated almost entirely on the major ecclesiastical institutions of the region. Among these were the bishopric itself, the Church of St. Michael at Planciano, the monastery dedicated to Saints Theodore and Martin, and the monastery of St. Erasmus at Formia. These were the most ancient and respected religious foundations in the duchy. An association with them carried both spiritual and political significance. The tendency to support these older institutions was unlikely to be accidental. Age and tradition carried enormous weight in the political culture of the time. A connection to ancient foundations allowed noble families to present themselves as part of a long and continuous social order. By aligning themselves with the oldest religious centres, they reinforced the impression that their authority rested on deep historical roots, rather than recent ambition. Yet the noble families of Gaeta did not rely solely on donations to existing churches. In certain cases, they also established or controlled churches of their own. One family in particular stands out in this regard: the Kampuli. Evidence suggests that they maintained connections with a church dedicated to Saints John and Paul, and also held direct control over two additional religious foundations. One of these was the Church of St. Gregory at Castro Argento. Another was the Church of St. Martin at Casa Hortali. Such control over churches was not common in Gaeta during the 10th century. Aside from the ruling Doibilian dynasty itself, the Kampuli appear to be the only major family known to have possessed proprietary churches during this period. Later centuries would see other families following the same path. But at this stage, such privileges were rare and closely associated with the highest levels of aristocratic society. Similar patterns appear in other coastal cities. In Naples, for example, the powerful family associated with John the Miles also owned a church. The Azabri family possessed one as well. These examples suggest that the ability to control a church was not simply a matter of piety. It was a privilege largely reserved for the most influential families. Private churches of this kind were already common in parts of northern Italy, where they had appeared much earlier. Their presence in the south, however, seems to have developed somewhat later. Owning a church offered several advantages. It provided spiritual protection for the family that controlled it, increased the family's economic resources through associated lands and offerings, and, perhaps most importantly, reinforced its public prestige. The significance of the Kampuli family controlling their own churches should not be underestimated. Through these foundations, they demonstrated that their power and wealth was sufficient to sustain religious institutions independently. This was a clear statement of status. It showed that the Kampuli could stand alongside the ruling dynasty, rather than simply serving under it. Their actions also carried an implicit political message. By supporting their own churches while continuing to participate in the religious life of the duchy, the Kampuli signalled that their influence was not entirely dependent on the patronage of the Doibilian rulers. They were powerful in their own right, capable of sustaining institutions and followers without relying entirely on ducal favour. This independent posture had long-term consequences for the political stability of Gaeta. The older noble families of the duchy, including the Kampuli, often maintained a certain distance from the ruling dynasty. They accepted the authority of the Doibilians and occasionally received land from them. They participated in public affairs as witnesses to official acts. Yet they never became fully integrated into a unified political structure centred on the ruling family. This cautious distance gradually weakened the foundations of ducal authority. The Doibilians depended on the cooperation of the leading noble houses, but those houses preserved their independence wherever possible. Their support was often conditional, rather than unconditional. The reasons for this attitude may lie in the origins of Doibilian rule itself. When the dynasty first rose to power in Gaeta, it likely did so through force as well as wealth. Armed supporters and foreign mercenaries may have played a role in establishing their authority. For older aristocratic families with deep roots in the region, resistance may not have been feasible at the time. Faced with this situation, the established noble clans appear to have adopted a pragmatic approach. They accepted the new rulers and worked with them when necessary. At the same time, they avoided becoming too dependent on ducal patronage. Their own landholdings and networks of support allowed them to maintain a degree of autonomy. In the short term, this strategy may have protected their interests. Over the long term, however, it contributed to political fragmentation. Without the full loyalty of the established nobility, the ruling dynasty struggled to build a unified system of authority. The problem was compounded by the nature of land ownership in the duchy. Noble families often held estates scattered across a wide territory rather than concentrated in a single region. This arrangement could function effectively only in a stable political environment. During the later decades of the 10th century, that stability began to weaken. The Doibilians themselves were already encountering difficulties managing their lands. Internal disputes within the ruling family revealed tensions over the distribution of remaining public property. These problems affected not only the rulers, but also the noble families whose wealth depended on estates spread throughout the duchy. As political tensions increased, maintaining control over distant lands became more complicated. By the beginning of the 11th century, the conditions that had allowed Gaeta's aristocracy to prosper were changing rapidly. External pressures from neighbouring powers intensified. Internal rivalries multiplied. Territories that had once formed a relatively cohesive political unit began to fragment. For both the ruling dynasty and the older noble families, the coming century would bring challenges unlike those of the past. The era that followed would be defined not by stability, but by transformation. The 11th century opened a new chapter in the history of Gaeta and the surrounding coastal states. During the previous century, the political landscape had been remarkably stable. One ruling dynasty had remained in power, and the same noble families had dominated public life. By the end of the 10th century, however, signs of strain were already visible. The ruling family faced increasing difficulty maintaining control over its resources and territories. Disputes over land began to divide members of the dynasty. More importantly, these conflicts reveal a shift in political identity. Individuals involved in these disputes began to identify themselves not simply as subjects of the Duchy of Gaeta, but as representatives of smaller regional jurisdictions. Territories such as Fondi and Traietto began to emerge as distinct centres of authority. The 11th century would bring a succession of political upheavals that transformed the duchy entirely. New rulers arrived from outside. Old alliances collapsed. Structures that had defined the region for generations gradually disappeared. Understanding this transformation requires examining events from several perspectives. The sequence of regime changes provides the framework. The fragmentation of the duchy itself reveals deeper structural changes, and the broader political environment of southern Italy shows that Gaeta's story was part of a larger regional pattern. One of the earliest signs of this shift appeared in disputes involving members of the aristocracy during the late 10th century. These conflicts shed light on the emergence of new territorial authorities within the duchy. A particularly revealing dispute occurred near the end of the century between Count Daufrius of Traietto and members of his extended family, including the Bishop of Gaeta and the Duke of Fondi. The conflict eventually reached the court of the German Emperor Otto III, who at the time was attempting to assert imperial authority across parts of Italy. Imperial intervention in southern politics was not new. Decades earlier, Otto I had issued a decree recognizing the rights of the papacy over various territories across the peninsula. Among the regions mentioned were Naples, Gaeta, and Fondi, as well as several other areas traditionally linked to papal authority. These declarations reflected the complicated political reality of Italy at the time. Cities such as Amalfi were already drifting toward the influence of neighbouring powers, like Salerno. Imperial authority existed largely in theory rather than in practice. Despite the involvement of outside rulers, the Duchy of Gaeta initially retained a degree of internal coherence. Earlier disputes among local nobles were still judged by the Duke of Gaeta himself, suggesting that his authority was recognized throughout the territory. Yet the balance was delicate. The ruling family attempted to maintain stability by ensuring that succession remained in experienced hands. Instead of allowing power to pass immediately to the sons of previous rulers, leadership sometimes moved between brothers in order to avoid the risks of a child inheriting the duchy. Such decisions reveal an awareness of growing vulnerability. Public lands, which had long served as a source of political support, were becoming increasingly scarce. Without these resources, maintaining loyalty within the duchy became more difficult. Events soon proved that these concerns were justified. At the beginning of the 11th century, a rapid succession of deaths within the ruling family brought a young child to the ducal throne. The new ruler inherited a title but little real power. At first, the situation did not seem disastrous. Official documents continued to be issued in the name of the young duke, and the administrative routines of the duchy continued. Soon, however, the weaknesses of minority rule became evident. Local powers began to assert greater independence. The Counts of Traietto were among the first to take advantage of the situation. Documents from this period show them acting as rulers in their own right, issuing decisions and resolving disputes without reference to the Duke of Gaeta. Even more revealing is the presence of powerful neighbours in these proceedings, including the Prince of Capua and the Duke of Naples. The absence of the Duke of Gaeta from such gatherings speaks volumes about the shifting balance of power. Authority was no longer concentrated in a single centre. Internal divisions further complicated the situation. Within the ruling family itself, there were struggles over the regency controlling the young duke. Rival relatives competed for influence, while external powers watched closely for opportunities. Gradually, the duchy began to fragment into smaller territories. Each region developed its own leadership and alliances. The political map that had once been dominated by a single dynasty was being reshaped into a patchwork of local authorities. These developments marked the beginning of a long period of instability. Over the course of the 11th century, Gaeta would pass through multiple regimes. Foreign rulers would intervene repeatedly, and the political structures that had defined the duchy for generations would eventually disappear. From the earliest surviving records, the story of Gaeta is closely connected with that of Naples. Political contact between the two cities did not fade with time. On the contrary, it continued to shape events throughout the 11th century. Evidence from the early decades of that century shows the rulers of Naples and Gaeta interacting directly in legal and political matters. Around the year 1014, the Duke of Naples, Sergius, appeared as an observer during a legal dispute held at Castro Argento within the territory connected to Gaeta. His presence indicates that relations between the two states were not distant or purely diplomatic. The Neapolitan ruler was personally involved in affairs occurring within Gaetan territory. A few years later, the connection became even clearer. In 1029, Sergius appeared again, this time at Gaeta itself. A surviving document from that year records a promise made by the Neapolitan duke in the presence of the Gaetan ruling family and the leading men of the city. At the time, Sergius had been expelled from Naples by the powerful prince, Pandulf, of Capua. Seeking allies, he offered the people of Gaeta favourable terms if they helped him regain his throne. In particular, he guaranteed that merchants and travellers from Gaeta would be allowed to enter Neapolitan territory for trade without paying the customary tolls normally demanded by officials and port authorities. The proposal clearly proved attractive. With assistance from Gaetan forces and the support of Norman mercenaries, Sergius soon succeeded in reclaiming control of Naples. His period of exile had been brief, and documents from the same year show that Pandulf's authority over Naples lasted only a short time. Yet the episode also raises questions about the military strength of Gaeta itself. If Gaeta had been a powerful military ally, its support might have been decisive. But events soon demonstrated that the duchy was vulnerable. Only a few years later, in 1032, Gaeta fell victim to the ambitions of the same Capuan power that had temporarily displaced Sergius in Naples. The nearly simultaneous weakness of both cities suggests that neither state possessed the strength to resist larger regional forces for long. The alliance between Gaeta and Naples may therefore have been motivated by more than military concerns. Family connections also appear to have played a role. A contemporary chronicler reports that the sister of the Duke of Naples had been married to the ruler of Gaeta. After the death of her husband, she became a widow just as Sergius was struggling to recover his throne. Once he regained power, Sergius arranged a new marriage for his sister, giving her hand to the Norman leader, Rainulf. This marriage, concluded around 1030, helped strengthen the alliance between the Neapolitan ruler and the rising Norman forces in southern Italy. The identity of this woman remains uncertain. She may have been the widow of an earlier Duke of Gaeta, or possibly the widow of a regent who had governed the city during a minority. In either case, the sources offer no clear answer. What is certain is that the political atmosphere within Gaeta during the regency that followed was tense, and the widow may have found it advantageous to leave the city through a new marriage alliance. Despite the collapse of the ruling Doibilian dynasty later in the century, the relationship between Gaeta and Naples did not disappear. Even after Gaeta passed through a period of instability and eventually fell under Norman control in 1068, connections between the two cities remained important. The Norman ruler Geoffrey Riddell, who attempted to establish his own ruling line in Gaeta, reinforced this relationship through marriage. His daughter was married to the Duke of Naples, John VI. 2 centuries after Gaeta had first emerged as an independent political centre, the influence of Naples still shaped its political life. While Naples played an important role in Gaeta's history, Rome also exerted a significant influence. In this context, the name Rome refers primarily to the papacy and the territories under papal control rather than to the city's population alone. During the late 9th century, lands previously belonging to the papal patrimony were placed under the administration of the rulers of Gaeta. These lands were entrusted to them as representatives of papal authority. The arrangement did not unfold exactly as the papacy might have intended. The Dukes of Gaeta gradually absorbed many of these territories into their own domain. Instead of managing them strictly on behalf of the papacy, they often treated them as possessions of their own state. Even so, certain regions retained stronger ties to Rome than others. Terracina offers a clear example. Documents from the early 10th century show that members of the Gaetan ruling family held authority there and even carried the title of Duke of Terracina. Another branch of the same dynasty governed the nearby city of Fondi. Yet after the decline of the Doibilians, Terracina followed a different path from the rest of the duchy. In Terracina, official documents began to be dated according to the reign of the Pope, rather than according to local rulers. This practice suggests that the city had returned more directly to papal influence. Evidence from the late 10th century shows that the city and its surrounding district were entrusted to a Roman noble named Crescentius. He was described with titles that emphasized his status among the aristocracy of Rome. This Crescentius belonged to a powerful Roman family, connected to other leading dynasties in central Italy. His relatives held authority in several regions near Rome, demonstrating that the city of Terracina had become part of a wider political network dominated by Roman aristocratic families. Around the year 1000, the control of Terracina changed again. The Pope transferred authority over the city to a count named Daufarius, who appears to have been connected to the ruling family of Gaeta. The decision may have served two purposes at once. By placing the city under a Gaetan noble loyal to Rome, the papacy could limit the influence of powerful Roman families, while also drawing Gaeta more closely into its political sphere. Despite this arrangement, the rulers of Gaeta did not adopt papal dating in their own documents. Their administration continued to operate largely independently. The evidence from Terracina itself suggests that the city maintained a stronger orientation toward Rome than toward Gaeta. The distinction becomes even clearer when examining the individuals who appear in the documents of each city. The names of witnesses and landowners recorded in Terracina rarely appear in Gaetan records. Families active in one region were largely absent from the other. This separation indicates that the two communities operated within different social and political networks. In contrast, Terracina shared closer connections with the neighbouring city of Fondi. Documents from the 11th century show individuals who owned land in both territories. A man from Fondi, for example, once fell ill while visiting his father-in-law in Terracina. After recovering, he donated property located between the two cities to the Bishop of Terracina in gratitude for his healing. The rulers of Fondi themselves deserve particular attention. The first Duke of Fondi emerged from the same Doibilian family that ruled Gaeta. Over time, however, Fondi developed into a separate political centre with its own leadership. By the end of the 10th century, disputes had already arisen between members of the family governing different territories. One such dispute concerned the boundaries between the lands of Fondi and those of Traietto. Even as the territories drifted apart politically, the family ties between their rulers remained strong. Dukes of Fondi frequently appeared as witnesses in legal proceedings held at Gaeta. They attended court sessions, participated in disputes involving bishops and noble families, and helped administer the affairs of the wider dynasty. These connections continued even after the ruling family lost its authority in Gaeta itself. Dukes of Fondi still took part in legal proceedings in nearby territories and maintained relationships with other branches of the family. At the same time, however, they increasingly pursued their own interests. Geography may have influenced this shift. The plain surrounding Fondi was dominated by marshland, which limited its agricultural productivity. As a result, the rulers of the city began to extend their influence toward more fertile territories inland. These areas offered better opportunities for cultivation and economic growth. The Dukes of Fondi also controlled churches, castles, and estates spread across a broad landscape. In the later 11th century, several of them transferred large portions of their holdings to the monastery of Monte Cassino. These donations included not only lands but also churches, vineyards, mills, and fortified settlements. Such large transfers were not merely acts of religious devotion, they also had a political dimension. By placing their property under the protection of a powerful monastery, the rulers of Fondi may have hoped to secure allies during a period of growing instability. Monte Cassino was one of the most influential religious institutions in southern Italy and enjoyed strong support from regional princes. The monastery itself was expanding rapidly during this period. Its leaders sought to increase their territorial holdings and often received support from powerful rulers eager to demonstrate their loyalty to the church. In disputes over land, the abbey frequently succeeded in defending its claims with the help of imperial or princely authority. As a result, Monte Cassino gradually acquired significant influence along the borders of the Gaetan Duchy. Local rulers sometimes donated castles or estates to the monastery in exchange for protection or political support. These arrangements reveal how religious institutions could play an important role in the shifting balance of power across southern Italy. The broader pattern that emerges from these developments challenges the traditional image of Gaeta as an isolated and fiercely independent state. In reality, the duchy existed within a complex network of relationships involving Naples, Rome, Monte Cassino, and other regional powers. Alliances, marriages, legal disputes, and territorial transfers all tied Gaeta to the political life of its neighbours. Throughout its history, the city's position along the coast made it both strategically valuable and economically active. Its harbour connected it to wider Mediterranean trade routes, while its territory lay between competing centres of power. As a result, Gaeta's political life was constantly shaped by forces beyond its own borders. By the 11th century, these external pressures were becoming increasingly visible. The duchy faced intervention from Capuan princes, influence from Roman aristocratic families, and growing involvement from powerful monasteries. These developments gradually transformed the political landscape of the region. Understanding Gaeta's history therefore requires looking beyond the city itself. Its rulers, nobles, and merchants were deeply embedded in the wider networks of southern Italy. The relationships they formed with neighbouring powers helped determine the fate of the duchy and shaped the course of its development during the centuries that followed. During the late 10th and early 11th centuries, the internal administration of Gaeta began to change in subtle but important ways. One of the clearest signs of this transformation appears in the growing role of judges within the city's political life. Earlier documents rarely show local nobles acting as independent arbiters in legal disputes, since such matters were normally brought before the ruling duke. Yet by the year 981, a notable shift had taken place. In a dispute between the two sons of Duke Gregory, it was not the duke himself who delivered judgment. Instead, a group of Gaetan nobles handled the case. The reigning duke at that moment was Marinus, but the matter was never referred to him. This episode reveals that authority within the duchy was slowly becoming more distributed, and that respected members of the community were beginning to assume responsibilities once reserved for the ducal court. As the 11th century progressed, individuals identified with the title of judge appear far more frequently in surviving documents. One figure named Gregory stands out particularly clearly. His name appears repeatedly in legal proceedings conducted alongside the duke, and he is often placed at the head of witness lists in land transactions, recorded between the years 1021 and 1037. The consistency of these appearances suggests that Gregory had made a career out of this judicial role. Interestingly, nothing in the documents indicates that he belonged to an old noble family. His background remains unknown, and even his father's name is never mentioned. Yet the position he held carried considerable prestige. Being known as a judge could itself become a mark of social status. Evidence for this comes from a document dated to 1054, in which a witness carefully identified himself as the son of John the Judge, proudly emphasizing his father's title as a defining part of the family identity. The functions performed by judges also expanded over time. In earlier records, they appear mainly as witnesses who confirm the legitimacy of transactions or agreements. By the mid-11th century, however, they were acting in more active legal roles. In a dispute from the year 1053, a judge named Rivalry represented two men who were contesting ownership of land against Leo, the bishop of Gaeta. When the Duke Atanulf demanded proof of the claim, it was Raimari who produced the necessary documentation. Although the men he represented ultimately lost the case, the surviving record offers valuable insight into the judicial system of the city. Judges were not merely passive witnesses. They could act as advocates and representatives for individuals engaged in legal conflict. Other judges appear performing different functions connected to the administration of the duchy. A man named Bonus is recorded, standing beside Duke Atanulf in 1057, and later, again in 1063, alongside the Duke's widow and son. In the latter case, he formally consented to a land donation made by Maria. The significance of this action becomes clearer when considering earlier traditions in Gaeta. In the past, one of the Duke's duties had been to approve the legal transactions of minors. Yet here, that responsibility was performed by a judge rather than by the ruling Duke. This suggests that some of the traditional powers associated with the ducal office were gradually being delegated to legal specialists. Judges continue to appear in prominent positions well into the following century. In 1109, a judge named John is recorded attending a court held by Richard, the Duke of Gaeta. The same figure later appears in documents issued during the rule of another Duke Richard, the son of Bartholomew, in the years 1121 and 1123. In one of these records, his name appears before that of 4 consuls listed among the witnesses, a detail that demonstrates his high standing within the city's hierarchy. It is possible that this judge was the same man known elsewhere as John Caracci, though the evidence is not entirely certain. If the identification is correct, his career would illustrate how an individual of relatively modest origins could rise to become one of the most influential figures in Gaetan political life. There are also indications that as political authority became more localized during the 11th century, different communities within the duchy began to develop their own judges. For example, a judge named Franco served in the town of Trito between the years 1030 and 1039. He appears frequently in documents connected to the settlement of Flumetica, where he seems to have been an active and respected member of the local community. In another document from 1064, which records the settlement of a dispute between the Counts of Suyo and the Abbot of Monte Cassino, 3 different judges appear as witnesses. Each one identified himself by the locality he represented, showing that judicial authority was becoming attached to specific communities, rather than remaining concentrated solely at the ducal centre. A similar development can be observed in the nearby maritime city of Amalfi. Judges had long been present there as well, and by the 11th century their importance had clearly grown. Many surviving documents show them acting as witnesses to ducal charters and private transactions. Their presence added legal weight to agreements and served as a form of protection in the event of future disputes. Although not every transaction required a judge, the frequency with which they appear suggests that their authority was widely respected. The relationship between judges and other administrative roles also becomes visible in the records. One document from 1059 refers to a man who described himself as both judge and curial official while purchasing land. The same individual appears decades later, still holding the same dual title. This combination hints at the path by which many men entered judicial service. The notarial profession, which involved writing and recording legal documents, likely served as the training ground for future judges. Evidence of this process appears in another record from 1062, where a man named Leo, son of a judge, completed a document originally written by his own son. This suggests that younger members of the family were learning the skills of writing and documentation under the supervision of their elders, with the hope of eventually achieving the respected title of judge. The origins of most judges remain difficult to trace. In many cases, the documents give only the individual's title and personal name, without identifying his family background. This pattern implies that the title itself functioned as a sufficient form of identification. Nevertheless, a few judges did belong to established noble lineages. One example is a judge named John, who lived in the early 11th century and was descended from a count several generations earlier. Such cases, however, appear to have been exceptions rather than the rule. Overall, the evidence suggests that the number of judges active in cities, such as Amalfi and Gaeta, was relatively small. Certain names recur repeatedly in the surviving documents, indicating that the same individuals served for long periods and built lasting reputations within their communities. These men may have formed part of a broader group sometimes referred to as the good men, respected citizens who helped resolve disputes and maintain civic order. Despite their growing influence, judges in this period were not professional lawyers in the modern sense. They did not belong to a formally organised legal profession, nor were they paid officials who devoted their entire careers exclusively to legal work. Instead, they were prominent members of their communities who performed judicial duties as part of their broader role in public life. Their authority came from reputation, experience, and social standing rather than from specialised legal training. Occasionally, other figures appear in the documents performing similar representative functions. Advocates, for example, sometimes acted on behalf of individuals involved in disputes. Like judges, they do not appear to have received regular payment for their services. The legal culture of the time still relied heavily on personal authority and communal recognition, rather than formal professional structures. Only in the 12th century do the first signs appear that legal knowledge might be becoming a specialised field requiring formal education. One example comes from the city of Bari, where a notary named Byzantius prepared his will before travelling to the northern Italian city of Bologna to study law. Bologna had begun to emerge as a centre of legal learning, and Byzantius's decision to study there reflects a broader transformation taking place in European legal culture. Even in this case, however, the connection between the notarial profession and the legal world remained clear. His background as a notary had likely prepared him for advanced study of the law. Alongside judges, another important institution developed in Gaeta during the early 12th century, the office of consul. The individuals who held this position belonged to several prominent families that had risen to influence during the previous century. Their appearance in the records does not necessarily indicate the formation of a fully independent commune, as sometimes occurred in northern Italy. Instead, it reflects the gradual emergence of new urban elites, who played an increasing role in governing the internal affairs of the city. The timing of this development was probably influenced by broader political circumstances. Gaeta had fallen under the authority of Norman rulers based in the city of Capua. These rulers were often occupied with conflicts elsewhere and paid relatively little attention to the day-to-day administration of the coastal city. As a result, the local elites of Gaeta were able to organise their own institutions and manage many internal matters themselves. The Norman princes did not appear to object to this arrangement, intervening only when their authority was directly challenged. The surviving lists of consuls provide some insight into how this system functioned. At first, there seem to have been 4 consuls serving at any given time. By the late 1120s, that number may have increased to 6, although the dating system used in Gaeta makes it possible that 2 different groups served within a single recorded year. What is clear is that no individual served as consul in consecutive years. However, the same person could return to the office later in life, demonstrating that the position circulated among a relatively small group of influential families. All of the known consuls belonged to the newer aristocratic families that had emerged in Gaeta during the 11th century. Many of these families had originally gained status through professions such as writing, legal service, or administration. Over time, they converted that status into political power, eventually dominating the leadership of the city. The consuls exercised authority in several important areas of civic life. One document from 1123 shows Duke Richard promising the judge and consuls of Gaeta that the city's coinage would remain unchanged. This agreement highlights one of the key responsibilities of the consuls: overseeing the economic stability of the city. In another case, the consuls became involved in a dispute with a Roman merchant, illustrating their role in regulating trade and commercial activity. They also handled matters connected to the internal organization of the city. In 1124, for example, a man named Doibilis promised the consuls that a house he planned to build would not exceed the height of his nephew's house and would follow the legal regulations governing construction. Such decisions suggest that the consuls oversaw urban planning and perhaps attempted to control the prestige associated with tall family towers, which were becoming common symbols of status in medieval cities. Financial management also fell within their responsibilities. In 1129, the consuls declared that profits from certain economic activities in the city, including dye works operated by members of the Jewish community and revenues from salt production, should be directed toward the needs of Gaeta itself. A few years later, another decision imposed a tax on the sale of olive oil, with the proceeds designated for lighting the city's cathedral. The consuls were also active in external relations. They negotiated agreements with merchants and neighbouring cities, concluded peace treaties, and handled disputes arising from maritime conflicts. One agreement from 1129 settled tensions with merchants from Naples, whose ship had been seized. In another treaty, Gaeta concluded a 10-year peace with the Duke of Naples. Despite these diplomatic efforts, relations between cities could still be tense. Conflicts occasionally arose with nearby lords or rival trading communities. Gaeta even entered into alliances with neighbouring rulers in disputes against other towns along the coast. Had this political development continued uninterrupted, Gaeta might have evolved into a fully independent maritime commune, similar to those emerging in northern Italy. However, this experiment in civic self-government did not last. During the 1140s, the Norman monarchy consolidated its authority across southern Italy, and Gaeta was brought more firmly under royal control. After this point, references to consuls largely disappear from the documentary record. In the decades following the political upheavals of the mid-11th century, the social landscape of Gaeta began to change in ways that reshaped the structure of power in the city. The transformation did not occur overnight. Several long-established families remained influential even after the crisis that followed the fall of ducal authority in the early 1030s. Networks that had supported the former ruling dynasty continued to operate for some time, and some of those connected to the older order maintained their position within the city's elite. Yet the turmoil also altered the balance of influence among Gaeta's leading families. Some lineages gradually faded from public life, disappearing from the surviving records within a generation. Others survived but retreated temporarily from political visibility. Even families that had once enjoyed strong patronage relationships experienced periods of silence in the documentation before re-emerging decades later. Against this shifting background, a new group of families began to appear with increasing frequency. Their rise reflects a broader transition in Gaetan society. Instead of relying primarily on inherited noble status, these families built influence through wealth, practical alliances, and participation in the administrative and economic life of the city. One of the clearest examples of this process can be seen in the family later known as the Caracci. In the early 11th century, several members of this family expanded their holdings beyond their original properties in the western parts of the duchy. By the 1030s, they were acquiring land in the district of Flumetica. Their transactions show that the political boundary between Gaeta and neighbouring territories did not prevent economic exchange. Individuals from cities under different political authorities continued to buy and sell land across these borders. Over time, the Caracci consolidated their position as local landowners. A will drawn up in the later 11th century reveals the extent of their estates. The document lists properties spread across several districts, including vineyards, fields, and other parcels of agricultural land. In keeping with the customs of the time, part of this property was assigned to religious institutions. Churches within Gaeta and in nearby settlements received donations that would ensure prayers for the donor's soul. Such acts of generosity toward religious foundations were common among emerging families seeking to reinforce their social standing. Supporting churches created visible ties between donors and sacred institutions, helping to establish reputations within the community. In the case of the Caracci, these gifts also demonstrated that they possessed enough wealth to distribute property beyond the needs of their immediate family. Unlike some of the older aristocratic clans of Gaeta, however, the Caracci were never among the highest ranks of the city's elite during their early history. Their gradual ascent illustrates how influence could develop step by step through property accumulation and public participation rather than through ancient lineage. Toward the end of the 11th century, their activities appear to slow. Members of the family still appear in legal documents, but mostly as witnesses, rather than as principal actors in transactions. This suggests that although they remained respected members of the community, their role had shifted toward one of participation in civic life, rather than aggressive expansion of their estates. One member of the family followed a particularly revealing career path. Beginning as a scribe responsible for drafting documents, he later acquired the title of judge. This change indicates an increase in prestige. The role of judge carried considerable authority within the city, especially in matters involving property disputes and legal agreements. By the early 12th century, he owned land in the city itself and was known simply by his judicial title, demonstrating that his professional role had become his primary social identity. Another document from the 1120s shows that members of the Caracci family still held property within the urban centre. In this case, a widow and her son sold a cellar located inside the city. Such properties were valuable not only as storage spaces but also as commercial premises in a busy port town where goods were constantly arriving and departing. The appearance of a personal name associated with another prominent family within the Caracci lineage is also noteworthy. This suggests that earlier relationships of patronage or alliance were remembered long after the original circumstances had faded. Even as the family established itself independently, traces of these earlier connections remained embedded in naming traditions. While the Caracci family provides one example of social mobility in Gaeta, they were not alone. Several other families rose to prominence during the same period, each following slightly different paths. The Coronella family offers a contrasting case. They appear in the records somewhat later and seem to have achieved prominence through the favour of particular rulers, rather than through the gradual accumulation of land. Members of this family were described as nobles of Gaeta during the middle decades of the 11th century. Their rise was closely connected to the support of the ruling duke of the time. Despite their elevated status, the Coronellas are not frequently associated with land transactions. Instead, the surviving evidence suggests that their wealth existed largely in the form of cash rather than landed estates. This difference may explain why they appear only sporadically in documents. which tend to record property exchanges rather than financial resources. A striking illustration of their financial strength comes from an episode involving the appointment of a bishop. A member of the Coronella family contributed a large sum of silver in order to secure the position for a favoured candidate. Although such actions were controversial in the wider church, they demonstrate the practical reality that wealth could exert decisive influence over ecclesiastical appointments in many places during this period. Later references to the family continue to emphasize financial activity rather than landholding. One document describes a loan made to a bishop, secured against a mill as collateral. When the debt was repaid, the property returned to ecclesiastical ownership. The episode highlights the fluid interaction between money, land, and political authority in the economy of the region. Another family that followed a distinctive trajectory was the Mancanella clan. Their earliest appearances show them owning modest properties, but their later prominence seems to have developed through administrative service. One member of the family served as a scribe under successive rulers of Gaeta. The position of scribe carried considerable importance in a society where legal transactions were increasingly recorded in written form. Drafting charters, recording agreements, and preserving legal language required specialized knowledge. Individuals who mastered these skills could become indispensable to both rulers and institutions. In the case of the Mancanellas, connections with a major church in the city appear to have reinforced their standing. Documents written by the family's scribe record donations to the church, and later, evidence suggests that he was buried within the church precincts. Such an honour implies a close relationship with the institution. After a period during which documentation becomes scarce, members of the Mancanella family reappear toward the end of the 11th century. By this time, they were landowners in several areas near Gaeta and continued to participate in legal proceedings held before the ducal court. A purchase made in the early 12th century illustrates both their wealth and their ambitions. A member of the family paid a remarkably high price for a parcel of land near the city. Comparable properties elsewhere were sold for much smaller sums. The high cost likely reflected the strategic importance of the location, situated just outside the urban area on the narrow peninsula where Gaeta stood. Owning land so close to the city may have carried social as well as economic advantages. As Gaeta expanded, nearby land would become increasingly valuable. The purchase may therefore represent an attempt to secure both profit and prestige. Despite their growing wealth, the Mancanellas lacked the titles traditionally associated with aristocratic status. Their investments in land may have been intended partly to compensate for this absence. By acquiring property in areas historically linked to earlier ruling families, they could present themselves as heirs to a longer tradition of local authority. Their ambitions appear to have succeeded. By the 1120s, members of the family held positions among the leading officials of the city. Some served as consuls, while others acted as judges in disputes involving prominent families. Through these roles, they became deeply involved in the governance and legal life of Gaeta. Evidence from the same period shows that the family's wealth had expanded considerably. One widow belonging to the clan surrendered an extensive collection of properties to the bishopric when she joined the religious community attached to the cathedral. Her holdings included houses, shops, vineyards, mills, and land scattered across numerous towns in the region. Such a broad distribution of property reflects the changing political environment of southern Italy during the late 11th and 12th centuries. As new rulers consolidated control over wider territories, economic opportunities expanded beyond the old boundaries of the Gaetan duchy. The story of these families illustrates a larger pattern. During the 11th and early 12th centuries, Gaeta witnessed the gradual formation of a new urban elite. Unlike the earlier aristocracy, whose status depended largely on inherited noble lineage and extensive rural estates, this emerging group relied on different sources of influence. Commercial activity played an important role. Many families invested money in trade, maritime ventures, or financial transactions. The city's position as a coastal port created opportunities for profit that could be converted into property, political office, or patronage of religious institutions. Public service also provided a path to prominence. Positions such as judge, scribe, and consul allowed individuals to participate directly in the administration of the city. Through these roles, they developed networks of influence that extended across legal, economic, and political spheres. Another characteristic shared by many of these families was the adoption of surnames. Earlier generations in Gaeta had usually been identified simply by personal names, combined with the name of a father. As the population grew and certain personal names became extremely common, this system became increasingly impractical. The use of surnames solved the problem of identification. In a commercial society where contracts and agreements were recorded in writing, it was essential that individuals could be clearly distinguished from one another. A distinctive surname made it easier to recognize participants in legal or financial transactions. Many of these surnames were unusual or colorful in origin. Some derived from nicknames or descriptive phrases rather than from geographic locations or noble ancestors. Their purpose was not to proclaim aristocratic descent, but simply to create a memorable identity. At the same time, the adoption of surnames may have served a symbolic purpose. As new foreign elites arrived in the region, particularly the Norman rulers who established authority over much of southern Italy, local families may have used surnames as a way to assert their own civic identity. By presenting themselves as identifiable lineages, they positioned themselves alongside the incoming aristocracy. The rise of these new families did not occur in isolation. Marriage alliances gradually linked many of them together. Through these unions, networks of kinship developed that reinforced political and economic cooperation within the city. Some families eventually disappeared from the records as quickly as they had appeared. Others endured for centuries, later being recognized among the noble lineages of Gaeta long after their original rise to prominence. The political history of the coastal duchies along the Tyrrhenian Sea cannot be understood without examining the economic foundations that supported their rulers and leading families. Beneath the visible struggles for power lay a deeper reality shaped by land, food production, and trade. Wealth from agriculture and commerce often determined which individuals or families could rise to influence. To understand how authority functioned in these duchies, it is essential to explore how their economies operated and how resources were distributed across their territories. The territory of Gaeta offers a particularly clear example of how geography could shape both economic activity and political ambition. The duchy extended along the coast between Terracina in the north and the Garigliano River in the south, while inland its territory stretched toward the hills around Vallacorsa and Ausonia. This landscape presented dramatic contrasts. Mountains rose sharply above the coastal plain, while in other areas lowlands lay only a few meters above sea level. In several places the terrain shifted so abruptly from mountain slopes to flat marshy ground that cultivation was extremely difficult. Rivers added another layer of complexity to this environment. Smaller streams descended rapidly from the hills behind Gaeta and Formia, reaching the sea after only short distances. In contrast, the Garigliano River flowed slowly across a wide plain, gathering water from numerous tributaries before reaching the coast. These natural features divided the duchy into three distinct zones. One was the plain around Fondi and Terracina, another, the central uplands surrounding Gaeta itself, and the third, the fertile river valleys near the Garigliano. The plain of Fondi, in its medieval form, was far wetter than it is today. Marshes dominated large parts of the region, shaping both settlement patterns and travel routes. Even the ancient Roman road network avoided the most waterlogged areas. The main road running north and south passed along the edges of the marshes rather than cutting directly across them. Historical evidence suggests that flooding remained a persistent problem for centuries. Settlements in this area therefore clustered along the margins of the plain. Towns such as Fondi developed on slightly elevated slopes, where fertile soil met the lower hills. Other communities appeared along the coastline, where conditions were somewhat drier. In the centre of the plain itself there are almost no traces of medieval habitation, suggesting that much of the area remained difficult to cultivate or inhabit. The agricultural use of this landscape remains difficult to reconstruct because surviving documents rarely describe how land was exploited. Written records tend to focus on ownership and transactions rather than everyday farming practices. However, modern observations of the region offer clues about how similar landscapes were likely used in the past. Olive trees still line parts of the old Roman road between Terracina and Fondi, while cereals and vines grow near coastal lagoons. Reeds also flourish in the marshy areas. Reeds were not a trivial resource. In medieval households they served many practical purposes, from construction materials to lighting. Other coastal cities in southern Italy deliberately cultivated reeds for domestic use, and it is likely that the inhabitants of the Fondi plain did the same. Lakes within the region also provided valuable resources. Fish from these waters could be collected as rents owed to local rulers, suggesting that fishing was an organised and economically significant activity. Further evidence from nearby towns supports this picture. Some documents describe marshlands used for catching fish and eels, while others record attempts to transform uncultivated land into productive fields. Long leases granted to farmers sometimes required tenants to improve the land before fully exploiting it. These arrangements reflect the uncertain productivity of terrain that required considerable effort before it could support reliable agriculture. Moving southward, the landscape changes dramatically. The central highlands around Gaeta are characterized by steep hills and limestone formations. Communication routes through these hills followed narrow corridors between mountains and the sea. The ancient coastal road remained the main line of travel, connecting settlements scattered along the shoreline. Although these highlands appear rugged, documentary evidence shows that cultivation took place wherever conditions allowed. Vineyards were especially common along the coastal slopes. Records mention vineyards near several coastal settlements and in valleys leading inland. Other vegetation, including woodland, also existed in the region, but vines appear to have dominated agricultural production. One striking absence from the records is the cultivation of grain. Documents describing the Central Highlands rarely mention cereal fields, even though mills operated nearby. Since mills require grain to function, this raises an important question about the food supply of the duchy. The answer likely lies in the eastern territories of Gaeta. This region was dominated by two river systems, the Ausente and the Garigliano. Their valleys form fertile corridors where agriculture could flourish. The Garigliano in particular flowed through a broad landscape fed by many smaller rivers, creating a region known in medieval sources as a land of rivers. In these river valleys, agricultural activity appears to have been much more diverse than in the uplands. Vineyards existed alongside grain fields, woodland, and pasture. The pattern suggests a mixed agricultural economy designed to support both local consumption and broader economic needs. Grain fields were often located near mills, making it easier to process crops without transporting them over long distances. The Garigliano Valley in particular shows evidence of intensive cultivation. Fields producing grain and vines were scattered throughout the area, while forests and watermills supplemented the agricultural landscape. Even further inland, records mention woodland and vineyards, covering hillsides above the valleys. This eastern region therefore differed significantly from the central uplands. Instead of relying heavily on vineyards alone, it supported a combination of crops and resources. Such diversity would have made it one of the most economically valuable areas within the duchy. It is not surprising that many influential families owned land there. Control of productive farmland meant control of food supplies, and food supplies were essential for maintaining power. The ruling family of Gaeta held extensive property in these valleys, as did several other prominent clans. Neighbouring powers also recognised the value of this land. The princes of Capua repeatedly attempted to expand their influence into this fertile region, contributing to the political struggles that eventually weakened Gaeta's ruling dynasty. Food production played a crucial role in maintaining political authority. A family that controlled farmland, grain supplies, and milling facilities could exert enormous influence over the population. Even if agriculture alone did not produce all the food required, these resources could still reinforce the power of those who managed them. Determining whether local agriculture could fully support the population of the duchy is difficult. Medieval population figures are rarely reliable, and surviving documents mention only a fraction of the people who actually lived in the region. However, patterns within the records offer clues. Many of the individuals who appear in surviving documents lived in areas where grain cultivation is not recorded. The city of Gaeta itself sits within a region dominated by vineyards, rather than cereal fields. This imbalance suggests that the city relied, at least partially, on grain produced elsewhere. Some grain likely came from the fertile eastern valleys. But even this supply may not have been sufficient for the entire population. Later, records clearly show grain being imported from distant regions, including North Africa and Sicily. Ships transported these supplies across the Mediterranean, ensuring that coastal cities could survive despite limited agricultural resources. Transporting grain by sea was far more efficient than moving it across difficult terrain. Grain could be shipped in bulk and then milled locally once it arrived. This helps explain why watermills in the duchy were so valuable. They served as the final stage in transforming imported grain into food for the population. The construction of new mills during periods of population growth reflects this reality. As more people settled in Gaeta, the demand for processed grain increased. Mills became essential infrastructure, linking external trade networks to the everyday survival of the city. Control of milling facilities therefore held enormous strategic value. A family that dominated the milling process could indirectly control access to food. Such control may have contributed to the long period of influence enjoyed by certain ruling dynasties in Gaeta. Agricultural production alone, however, does not tell the full story. The people who worked the land formed the foundation of the entire economic system. Yet identifying these cultivators is surprisingly difficult because written lease agreements survive only in small numbers. The few leases that do survive reveal long tenancy arrangements, often lasting several generations. Such agreements suggest a stable, rural society in which the same families cultivated the same land for extended periods. Written contracts may not have been renewed frequently because relationships between landlords and tenants remained relatively unchanged. These tenants appear to have been free cultivators, responsible only for delivering rent to their landlords. They were not bound permanently to the land, but their long-term leases provided security for both sides. Rent payments varied widely depending on the value of the land or equipment involved. At the same time, not all agricultural workers were free. Evidence from wills reveals the presence of slaves, performing specialized tasks such as milling, herding animals, or managing estates. Some were eventually freed and granted land or livestock, suggesting that slavery could evolve into dependent but free labor. Other individuals occupied ambiguous social positions somewhere between freedom and servitude. Disputes over personal status sometimes required legal intervention. In one notable case, a group of workers challenged the claim that they were slaves, eventually securing their freedom through legal proceedings and financial payment. Such episodes demonstrate how fluid social status could be in medieval rural society. Economic changes and political instability sometimes created opportunities for individuals to renegotiate their place within the social hierarchy. The economy of Amalfi followed a somewhat different pattern. Its dramatic coastal geography left little space for large-scale agriculture. The city lay within a narrow valley where steep cliffs descended almost directly to the sea. The surrounding mountains limited both settlement and cultivation. As a result, the inhabitants relied heavily on trade and specialized agriculture. Vineyards dominated the slopes above the city, producing wine that could be consumed locally or exported abroad. Fruit orchards and chestnut groves also appeared in various valleys and upland areas. However, grain production was extremely limited. The mountainous terrain made large cereal fields impractical, forcing the inhabitants to obtain grain from elsewhere. Trade, therefore, became a necessity rather than a luxury. Watermills played an important role here as well. Ownership of mills was restricted to wealthy families and religious institutions because the equipment required substantial investment. Portions of mills could even be divided among multiple owners, allowing families to share access to the milling process. Such divisions sometimes became extremely complex, with different owners controlling specific periods of operation. This system allowed mills to function as valuable economic assets that could be bought, sold, or inherited within families. Because grain was scarce locally, these mills likely processed imported supplies. Amalfi's merchants travelled widely across the Mediterranean, trading goods in North Africa and other regions. Grain imported through these networks could then be ground locally before distribution to the population. Agricultural activity within the duchy remained highly specialised. Vineyards, orchards, and woodland dominated the landscape. In some areas, farmers deliberately replaced one crop with another to meet market demands. Wine production appears to have been particularly important, suggesting that surplus wine may have been exported in exchange for grain and other necessities. The mountainous environment therefore shaped a distinctive economic system. Land resources were limited, but maritime trade compensated for agricultural shortages. Wealth accumulated through commerce allowed families to invest in mills, property, and political influence. Land ownership, nevertheless, remained an important symbol of status. In regions where land was scarce, even small plots could acquire high value. Mills and other productive facilities became substitutes for large estates, allowing families to maintain wealth despite the limitations of the terrain. Across the Tyrrhenian coast, economic connections extended beyond the borders of individual duchies. Merchants, farmers, and landowners moved between Gaeta, Amalfi, Naples, and neighbouring Lombard territories. These exchanges reflected both economic necessity and political opportunity. Some individuals left their home cities to settle elsewhere, leasing land or building houses in foreign territories. Others invested in farmland outside their own duchies, cultivating crops for both local consumption and trade. Such cross-border activity illustrates the interconnected nature of medieval coastal economies. Even relatively small cities were tied into wider networks of commerce, agriculture, and migration. Through these networks, resources could move where they were needed, supporting populations that local land alone could not sustain. Among the families that appear in the records of Amalfi during the Middle Ages, some offer clues about the connections linking the cities of the Tyrrhenian coast. One such example is a lineage traced back to a man named Cunari. In a document from the late 10th century, Cunari is described as originating from Capri. Decades later, another record associated with the same family refers to him as being from Marmorata, a district within the city of Naples. The difference in these descriptions makes it difficult to determine the true origin of the family. It is possible that one of its members had relocated from Amalfi to Naples, or that the family had branches in several coastal communities. What is clear is that movement between these cities was already occurring. The creation of the Norman kingdom in southern Italy during the 12th century appears to have intensified this movement. After the consolidation of Norman authority, individuals from different cities increasingly appear in the records of neighbouring regions. This suggests a rise in mobility, commercial exchange, and cross-regional investment. In Amalfi, for instance, documents from the mid-12th century mention people from Naples acquiring or selling property in areas outside the city. In one case, a woman from a Neapolitan family sold land in the hills beyond Amalfi, together with her daughter. In another record, the heirs of a man from Naples owned a share of a church located on the slopes above the city. Further evidence of this growing interaction appears in the activities of the Capisi family of Naples. This lineage had long been established in its home city and appears frequently in earlier Neapolitan records. By the 12th century, members of the family had begun to appear in Amalfi as well. One document describes a couple selling inherited land near the river valley, south of the city, to relatives who were connected through marriage to an Amalfitan family. The relationship between these families suggests that commercial investments were often reinforced by marital alliances. Marriages could strengthen economic cooperation, creating networks that linked merchants and landowners across city boundaries. Another marriage recorded several decades later illustrates the same pattern. A woman whose father had purchased land near Amalfi later sold that property, together with her children. Her husband belonged to the Capis lineage, and the transaction was conducted on behalf of relatives who still lived in Naples. A witness to the sale was a man whose name explicitly identified him as being from Naples. His presence suggests that Neapolitan families maintained an active interest in property transactions taking place within Amalfi. Not every individual whose name included a reference to Naples can automatically be assumed to have originated there. In some cases, such surnames may simply reflect earlier family connections or geographic associations. Yet other documents indicate that certain individuals who carried these names were clearly involved in commercial activities beyond their native city. One such man appears repeatedly as a witness in transactions within Amalfi, suggesting that he had become integrated into the political and economic life of the city. Records from the early 1170s reveal that this same figure and his brothers were engaged in a significant building project in Salerno. They had leased land in the Jewish quarter of the city and agreed to invest a substantial sum constructing houses there. Several years later, they divided the newly built properties with the heirs of the original owner. These transactions show that the family operated across multiple cities, investing in property and development wherever opportunities appeared. additional documents from the same period provide further hints about their background. In one case, the brothers participated in the execution of a will, together with a cleric, whose family was explicitly described as originating from Naples. Their collaboration suggests that they belong to the same social networks as other Neapolitan families active along the coast. Another document records a legal settlement between one of the brothers and a royal official whose father was also identified as Neapolitan. Such connections reinforce the likelihood that these entrepreneurs themselves had roots in Naples. Members of another Neapolitan family, the Brancati, also appear in Amalfitane records during this period. Their presence in Naples can be traced back to earlier centuries. Yet, by the 12th century, individuals bearing the same surname were selling property in the countryside near Amalfi. Although these documents do not always specify their origin, later records confirm that the family indeed came from Naples. The growing appearance of Neapolitan names in Amalfitane and Salernitan documents during the 12th century invites further explanation. One possible reason lies in the political changes brought about by Norman rule. The kingdom created by the Normans unified much of southern Italy under a single authority. In theory, this should have made travel and economic activity easier across former political boundaries. Yet movement between these regions had already been common long before Norman consolidation. Amalfitanes had settled in Naples earlier, and merchants from various coastal cities had long interacted through trade. The real change appears to lie not simply in mobility itself, but in the direction and intensity of migration. During the later 12th century, individuals from the larger city of Naples began appearing more frequently in the smaller coastal communities. Political tensions may have played a role in this shift. Naples had resisted Norman control for many years, and its eventual incorporation into the kingdom may have created new pressures within the city. Some families may have found the new political environment uncomfortable or unstable. Relocating to nearby cities where Norman authority had been established earlier could have offered a more secure setting for economic activity. Movement between territories was facilitated by the nature of political borders in southern Italy. Boundaries between neighbouring states were rarely rigid or closely controlled. In many regions, inhabitants of different political jurisdictions lived side by side. Areas located between Naples and Capua, or between Naples and Amalfi, often lacked a clear political identity. Residents from multiple states could own land in the same villages and conduct business across borders without major restrictions. Documents illustrate this fluid situation. Some property transactions involved land located in one territory, while the agreement itself was recorded in another city. In certain cases, it is even difficult to determine which political authority governed the area in question. Such ambiguity suggests that the concept of a fixed border meant little to the people who lived and worked along the Tyrrhenian coast. This openness made it relatively easy for migrants to establish themselves in new locations. Even individuals with limited resources could cross into neighbouring territories and seek opportunities there. Merchants, craftsmen, and minor landowners often moved freely between cities, sometimes acting as agents or representatives for others. These movements form part of a broader economic network linking coastal communities together. The motives behind such migration varied, but they were frequently connected to economic opportunity. The limited availability of land in places like Amalfi encouraged inhabitants to invest elsewhere. Some established themselves as landlords in nearby territories, while others focused on trade and maritime activity. These networks of land ownership and commerce benefited not only individual families, but also the cities involved, strengthening ties between them. For rulers, the presence of landowners and merchants operating across borders could serve as a useful symbol of political cooperation. When relations between states were friendly, merchants could travel more easily and economic exchange flourished. These connections created practical incentives for maintaining peaceful relations between neighbouring powers. Economic interaction also influenced the circulation of currency across the region. The documents from the Tyrrhenian cities reveal that several different coinages were used simultaneously. Amalfitans commonly employed their own currency known as the tari. During the 12th century, coins minted in Sicily began to appear more frequently as well, reflecting Amalfi's political integration into the Norman kingdom. In Gaeta, a slightly different pattern emerged. The city produced its own bronze coins, but many transactions were calculated, using Byzantine solidi or by weight in silver. During the 11th century, silver payments became increasingly common, eventually giving way in some cases to northern Italian coinage. Occasionally, Amalfitan coins appear in Gaetan transactions as well, indicating the presence of active trade between the two cities. Naples offers perhaps the most intriguing example of monetary interaction. From an early date, many transactions in the city were conducted using the tari, even though this coin originated elsewhere. Byzantine currency also circulated alongside it, and documents sometimes recorded exchange rates between the two systems. Despite occasional fluctuations in coin quality, these rates remained surprisingly stable over long periods. At times, uncertainty about currency supply forced adjustments in financial agreements. One lease from the mid-11th century specified that rent would be paid in Amalfitan coins as long as those coins remained available. If a new currency replaced them, the amount owed would change accordingly. Such provisions demonstrate the practical challenges merchants and landowners faced in an economy where multiple monetary systems coexisted. The wide circulation of different coins reflects the constant movement of merchants and goods between cities. Economic interaction extended well beyond immediate neighbours. Coastal communities maintained contacts with distant regions across the Mediterranean and throughout Italy. These connections linked local markets with wider trading networks. Urban centres played a crucial role in this system. The presence of aristocratic households within cities created demand for agricultural products from the surrounding countryside. At the same time, urban elites consumed luxury items imported from abroad. Markets within the cities served as meeting points where rural production, local crafts, and foreign goods all converged. Gaeta provides a vivid example of such urban commercial life. The city's marketplace stood near the ducal palace, forming a focal point for exchange. Documents mention warehouses used to store goods before distribution, suggesting an organized system of trade within the city itself. These warehouses appear to have been located in multi-story buildings, where shops occupied the lower floors and living quarters stood above them. The variety of professions recorded in Gaetan documents illustrates the complexity of the urban economy. Alongside members of the ruling family and the clergy appear craftsmen such as goldsmiths, blacksmiths, and painters. Teachers and builders also appear, revealing a diverse social environment sustained by commercial activity. Even groups of carpenters are described gathering in public squares, perhaps awaiting employment or discussing their work. Evidence of foreign merchants in Gaeta further confirms the city's role as a trading centre. Individuals from Amalfi appear in the records as early as the 9th century, while merchants from northern Italy also owned warehouses within the city. Such details indicate that Gaeta participated in broader commercial networks that extended far beyond its immediate surroundings. Amalfi's role in Mediterranean trade is even better documented. Merchants from the city travelled widely across Europe and the eastern Mediterranean. Communities of Amalfitans established themselves in places as distant as Egypt, Constantinople, and northern Italy. These traders transported luxury goods such as silk, while also dealing in agricultural products and other commodities. Gaetans also appear occasionally in distant markets. Records from northern Italy describe merchants from the city conducting business there and paying duties on the goods they brought. Other evidence places Gaetan travellers in Constantinople. In one case, a merchant who died there left money to churches back in his homeland, demonstrating the continued connection between expatriate traders and their native city. Among the luxury goods moving through these networks, silk was particularly prized. Wills and inventories from aristocratic families frequently mention silk garments and fabrics among their possessions. Such items were often imported from the Byzantine world, where silk production was carefully regulated by imperial authorities. Merchants from the Tyrrhenian cities served as intermediaries in distributing these textiles across Western markets. Jewish communities also played an important role in the commercial life of coastal cities such as Gaeta. Evidence suggests that Jewish craftsmen and traders operated dye workshops and other specialized industries. Their skills contributed to the production of textiles and other goods essential to urban economies. In some cases, city authorities attempted to regulate these activities in order to ensure that profits benefited the wider community. The presence of Jewish merchants may also have facilitated trade with Muslim regions of the Mediterranean. Jewish intermediaries often possessed linguistic and cultural connections that allowed them to operate between Christian and Muslim markets. Through these networks, goods and information could circulate even between regions separated by political or religious differences. One commodity that passed through these networks was human labour itself. Slavery remained present in southern Italy into the 11th century, and documents occasionally record individuals purchasing slaves from Muslim traders before freeing them. Although moral objections existed, slave ownership continued to appear in various records of the period. Commercial contacts with the Islamic world are confirmed by several other examples. Merchants from the Tyrrhenian cities travelled regularly to markets in North Africa and the Eastern Mediterranean. Some records mention traders who were absent overseas while their wives or relatives managed business affairs at home. These details reveal the extent to which maritime trade shaped the everyday lives of families in these coastal communities. The broader pattern that emerges from these scattered pieces of evidence is one of constant movement and exchange. Merchants, landowners, and craftsmen travel between cities, investing in property, conducting trade, and forming alliances through marriage. These interactions connected the Tyrrhenian duchies to each other and to distant regions of the Mediterranean. Despite their relatively small size, cities like Gaeta and Amalfi played an active role in wider economic networks. Their merchants navigated routes stretching from northern Italy to the eastern Mediterranean. Their markets attracted traders from neighbouring regions, and their political institutions adapted to the demands of an increasingly commercial world. Land ownership remained the foundation of wealth and influence, but trade added another dimension to the power of local elites. Families who combined agricultural resources with maritime connections could accumulate significant influence. Through their activities, these cities became more than minor coastal settlements. They served as dynamic nodes within the economic landscape of medieval southern Italy,